Chapter 70. Faced with Kyle's words, Fang Xinjian did not reply immediately. Instead, he took 3 big mouthfuls of the fragrant and delicious fish soup in the pot, finishing it in one go. Seeing that his potential points had increased by over 50 points, he wiped his mouth and said. He took a look at the manual on the table. He knew that he might be able to pick up the first level of this killing technique by just skimming through it. However, he did not pick it up in the end. It was because the current him no longer needed the first level of a killing technique. If he still had a few decades of lifespan left, it would be a good idea for him to be encyclopedic knowledge and integrate the sword techniques of various factions. However, to Fang Xinjian, who only had 4 years and 3 months left, the fastest way was to specialize in one type of sword technique and walk all the way to the pinnacle. Therefore, he paused for a moment before saying, "Teacher Kyle, the Empire is the strongest faction, but the factions are also the weakest empire. You said that I don't have freedom in the Empire, but if I were to join the School of Sword Arts, would everything be good?" "I can guarantee that." Kyle wanted to say more, but was stopped by Fang Xinjian with a wave of his hand. "Teacher Kyle, the price of freedom is to be in dire straits like you are now, right?" Fang Xinjian saw the change in Kyle's expression, but he did not stop. As he swept away the delicacies on the table, he said quickly, "If I want to obtain something, I naturally have to pay a price. If I want to obtain other people's resources and support, it's normal for me to pay a little bit of freedom. It's the same for the Empire, and it's the same for the School of Sword Arts. I don't believe that the School of Sword Arts will invest their resources on me without asking for anything in return. Even if some people won't, with so many members of the School of Sword Arts upper echelon, their families, relatives, and disciples, would they agree to it? Talent cannot obtain true freedom no matter where they go, and it's even more so for geniuses. Even if I become the School of Sword Arts head, is there nothing that can restrict me? Therefore, a bargaining chip like freedom is not attractive to me. And in terms of resources, the School of Sword Arts will never be able to match up to the Empire." Kyle frowned and said, "What you say might make sense, but you've never seen how dark the fights between the Empire's upper echelons are. Without any background, if you were to go there recklessly, Mr. Kyle." Fang Xinjian stopped eating. He looked up at Kyle and said, "Believe me, I've seen too much darkness and despair. But now I'm confident that with my own sword, I'll be able to slash through them all." Kyle stared at him. The two of them stared at each other for a while before Kyle sighed. "Your heart is firmer than mine. You're more suited for swordsmanship than I am." Fang Xinjian lowered his head and continued to eat. His mind was cold, but his words were flawless. He tried to imitate the tone of an ordinary person and said, "I thank you for enlightening me. So, if there's anything you need my help with, as long as it's within my power, I will do it." Kyle sighed. "I'm going to participate in the Sword Hero Battle next month. Whether I succeed or fail, I won't be coming back." Fang Xinjian nodded and then heard Kyle continue, "What I'm most worried about are those disciples in the dojo. I've temporarily handed over all the matters to Lambert. If he's in trouble, I'll still need you to help me take care of him." Fang Xinjian said calmly, "Don't worry, I'll do it." "Thank you." Kyle left. There seemed to be a hint of understanding in his eyes, but there also seemed to be an even deeper sense of desolation. Fang Xinjian did not know if he would be able to pass the sword hero battle. The only thing he could do was to take good care of himself and make himself stronger. After dinner, he was brought to a bedroom by the servants. Before he entered the room, he could smell a strange fragrance from afar. Fang Xinjian took in a deep breath and felt a refreshing feeling that he had never felt before wash over his entire body. Even his mind seemed to have cleared up a little. Opening the door, the strange fragrance became even more intense. It assaulted him, as if it had invaded every single cell in Fang Xinjian's body. It made him feel as if all the fatigue in his body had been swept away. The headmaster and Huang Lin had been standing inside for a long time. They looked at the water bucket that was as tall as a person and the pitch-black medicinal water that was continuously being heated up. The headmaster said, "Take off your clothes and go in." Fang Xinjian did not hesitate and took off his clothes, walking into the water bucket. "Circulate your waves and mental cultivation method. Don't stop. Absorb the medicinal effects to your heart's content," Huang Lin said. Fang Xinjian had been circulating his waves for 24 hours to begin with. Now, there was no problem at all. Every muscle and bone in his body started to move at an extremely fast speed. However, his state of mind was still clear, maintaining his calmness and rationality. With the circulation of the waves, he felt as if the medicinal water in the surroundings was boiling. Streams of aura that were like flames were crazily drilling into his body, as if they wanted to incessantly burn his organs, his blood vessels, and his nerves. "Bear with it," the headmaster said. "This is a medicinal herb ground using the Lulan beast as the main ingredient. The Lulan beast is born with the ability to communicate with ether particles. Every drop of blood and every piece of flesh in its body is tainted with a large amount of ether particles energy. Right now, we're combining various medicinal herbs to allow you to absorb the essence of the Lulan beast and modify your body, allowing you to have the recovery ability, endurance, and body's toughness of ferocious beasts." As he looked at the pained expression on Fang Xinjian's face and the streams of black aura dissipating from the surface of his body, a hint of heartache flashed on his face. "Even with the Academy's financial resources, we can only sustain such treatment for a month. During this month, you'll have to soak in this medicinal water every day. If you're lucky, not only will it increase your endurance attribute, it'll also allow you to obtain the specialty, berserkness. Do your best to absorb it. Don't waste a single bit." Fang Xinjian nodded. His breathing and blood continued to circulate according to the Sonido sword Zephyr wave. He could sense an increasingly strong scorching aura penetrating into his body, as if it was going to melt all of his flesh and blood into nothingness. The headmaster looked at Fang Xinjian. While his heart ached for the medicinal water, his eyes shone brightly. "Good, good, good. I've put in so much effort to reduce the Academy's expenses for the next 3 years, all for the sake of Fang Xinjian to be able to produce results. As long as he can become the champion in the regional selection, or even become a divine-level expert in the future, all of this will be worth it. Regional champion, national champion, and a divine-level expert from Cursed Royal Academy." Just the thought of it made the headmaster extremely excited. "Eat as much as you can. Even if I have to pile up, I'll pile you up until you become the regional champion." Just like that, Fang Xinjian cultivated his sword arts, waves, killing techniques, and consumed all sorts of medicinal food and ferocious beast essence every day. With an unprecedented attitude, the headmaster invested a large amount of resources in him. Huang Lin sparred with Fang Xinjian every day, continuously sharing his comprehensions in sword arts and various experiences in executing them to Fang Xinjian. Regardless of whether it was his attributes, specialties, or techniques, Fang Xinjian continued to grow at an unprecedented speed, becoming stronger and stronger. Of course, throughout this process, Huang Lin and the headmaster protected Fang Xinjian closely, not allowing him to be disturbed in the slightest. They also prevented him from having the chance to kill any monsters, preventing him from leveling up prematurely and wasting his potential by gaining job progression. 1 month later, just as Fang Xinjian was improving by leaps and bounds every day and night, on a hill on the Empire's west coast, a long-haired man dressed in night attire was looking at a small town thousands of meters away. Suddenly, he turned his head, looked at the adjutant beside him and said, "What did you say? Windstorm Sword Hero?" "That's right." An adjutant who was also dressed in night attire said, "According to reliable information, Fang Xinjian has successfully transitioned into a Windstorm Sword Hero." Chapter 71. Windstorm Sword Hero? I remember that there weren't many first transition jobs like this in the Empire's history, right? Yes, there have only been 3 in the Empire's history, and none of their descendants succeeded. Hearing his subordinate's report, the long-haired man's eyes flashed and he said calmly, "I didn't expect that a small sapling I casually planted could grow into a towering tree. How interesting!" The subordinate's expression changed and he asked, "Sir, do we need to ask the second prince?" "There's no need for that for now. Let the other clans test him out first." With that, the long-haired man took out a cylindrical object the length of an arm and placed it before his eyes. He squinted his eyes and said, "This thing is really interesting. A distance of a few hundred meters is like looking at a few meters away." The subordinate said, "This thing is called a telescope. I heard that the second prince found it while he was on his way to study. His Majesty has already given the order to manufacture it at full force, striving to equip all the members of the Night Order with it." Nodding, the long-haired man smiled and said, "The prey has entered the cave. Let's go." As he spoke, a slight breeze blew past. Behind the long-haired man, a blood-red cape fluttered in the wind, looking like a burning blood-red flame. It was an equipment exclusive to the Empire's conferred knight. It represented the power of a second transition conferred knight, as well as the glory of a conferred knight chosen from countless knights. It was a scarlet cape specially made by the Empire's armory. At the same time, with the long-haired man's command, over 100 silhouettes dashed out, charging towards the small city like sharp arrows. The long-haired man's lips curled up into a bloodthirsty smile. "Let's go. Kill them all." In the Knight Academy, after a month of training, Fang Xinjian had been going all out on his sword arts, waves, mental cultivation method, and all other aspects. Coupled with the fact that he had been continuously fighting ferocious beasts and heavenly and earthly treasures, as well as having a great expert like Huang Lin feeding him moves and imparting his experience, his abilities had improved by leaps and bounds. As for his waves, as he circulated his sword techniques 24 hours a day, his experience points were constantly rising crazily. Although he did not have enough talent in the area of waves, and each level required a large amount of experience points, he had still managed to raise his Sonido sword Zephyr Waves to level 3 within a month, gaining an increase in his strength by 3 points, 6 points in agility, 3 points in reaction, 3 points in endurance, and 3 points in flexibility. Apart from that, cultivating his sword technique 24 hours a day allowed him to squeeze out his potential and temper his attributes. In terms of the Ice Age meditation art, Fang Xinjian had relied on counts to clear away the distracting thoughts and injustice in his heart. In addition to this 1 month of polishing, he had finally leveled it up to level 2, allowing his thinking and calculation abilities to increase once again. As for the Supreme Mistwind Sword's killing technique, because it involved waves, mental cultivation methods, ether particles, and the flow of the atmosphere, this killing technique was indeed more complicated and profound than any of the sword techniques that Fang Xinjian had cultivated in the past. Thus, after a month of training, he had only reached level 18, not the maximum level. Of course, due to the fact that killing techniques had no benefits to the body, he did not gain any additional attributes even after reaching level 18. However, the level 18 Supreme Mistwind Sword, with its exquisite control over the body and air currents, allowed Fang Xinjian to continuously increase his speed to more than 3 times that of his original speed. However, although there were no additional attributes, the level 10 Supreme Mistwind Sword still allowed Fang Xinjian to have a finer grasp over the flow of air. This allowed him to condense high-speed air currents on his sword when he slashed through the air, creating a sword light several feet long. It was as though it was a piece of cake for him to slash through gold and jade. Within the medicinal tub, Fang Xinjian stood up slowly. The medicinal liquid, which had originally been as black as ink, had now become almost colorless. He could feel that the energy throughout his body had reached an unbelievable level, and waves of scorching essence chi were flowing around his body, as if they would explode at any moment. Under the stimulation of the medicinal effects, his body had become even stronger. Much of the nutrients and energy had been stored in every corner of his body, waiting to be unleashed at the moment of need. This made Fang Xinjian feel as though he had an inexhaustible amount of energy. Fang Xinjian stretched out his hand, and the attendant at the side handed him a dagger. He took the dagger and lightly sliced his finger. A wound suddenly appeared, but just as a drop of blood dripped out, Fang Xinjian tightened his finger's muscles slightly, and the wound closed up under his exertion of force. A few minutes later, a scab had formed. Not only had his abilities increased crazily, but his attributes had also increased tremendously. Soaking in medicinal liquid every afternoon for a month, the financial expenditure that had almost made the headmaster cry, had also finally allowed Fang Xinjian to obtain the specialty elementary berserkness, which allowed him to have extraordinary recovery abilities. Ordinary cuts and scrapes from swords and sabers would scab almost in the blink of an eye, and they would recover completely within 3 hours. Now, with his control over his muscles and blood, ordinary external injuries were almost negligible. Other than that, the medicinal effects had given him an astonishing amount of stamina. His breathing was now very long, and the endurance of his muscles was terrifying. If he were to only use ordinary sword techniques, he would have no problem fighting for 3 days and 3 nights. Even if he were to use the Supreme Mistwind sword, he would have to use it for 4 hours before his stamina would be depleted. With that, Fang Xinjian's attributes became: Name Fang Xinjian, age 16, occupation Windshadow sword, divinity level 10, strength 51 plus 4, agility 79 plus 4, reaction 50, endurance 43, flexibility 43. The attributes above come into effect once the Sonido sword Zephyr Waves is activated. Due to perfect muscles, plus 4 in strength and agility, 10% of the endurance attribute. Nurturing sword techniques 31 sets, training sword techniques 4 sets, Supreme Mistwind sword level 18, specialties: Genius swordsmanship, elementary survival instinct, internal healing, internal training, sword specialist, high agility, motion vision, heightened reflexes, perfect muscles, elementary berserkness potential 8,500 point increase, /day waves level 3, Sonido sword Zephyr Waves, mental cultivation, method level 2, ice age meditation art. Right now, when he performed the Supreme Mistwind sword, he would be able to increase his speed by 3 times in just a few minutes. There was even a 3-foot sword light formed from the high-speed air currents on his sword. If he were to use Boundaries negation, even he himself would be shocked by his battle prowess. But it's still not enough. At least the Rebecca from that day, with her over 100 points in strength, agility, and other attributes, she would still be able to suppress me. After all, Rebecca was a veteran expert at the pinnacle of the first transition. Moreover, with the support of the Treja clan, she had been fed with all sorts of heavenly and earthly treasures over the past few decades, as well as countless ferocious beasts. Coupled with the accumulation of time and the enhancement from the waves, she had attributes that far surpassed that of ordinary knights. Veteran first transition experts like her, as well as those who had gone through the second transition, were not rare in the Empire. However, to Fang Xinjian, such people were just a waste of resources. But if I were to use Boundaries negation, what are my chances of winning? Right now, Fang Xinjian had 50,000 potential points and could perform Boundaries negation at any time. This was because he had tested it once. Using 50,000 potential points to perform Boundaries negation for 50 seconds was his current limit. If he were to continue performing it, his physical body would probably collapse. And after performing it for 50 seconds, he would not be able to perform Boundaries negation for at least a day. It was a pity that Fang Xinjian had not seen Rebecca's limits. Therefore, although he estimated that after using Boundaries Negation and the Supreme Mistwind Sword for 20 seconds, he would be able to continue battling at supersonic speed for another 30 seconds, he was not sure if he would be able to win against Rebecca within these 30 seconds. However, excluding Rebecca, an old monster who had been at the pinnacle of the first transition for decades, ordinary first transition knights would probably not be a match for Fang Xinjian at all. As he thought of this, he threw away the dagger in his hand and calmly instructed, "Clothes." There were naturally people who helped him bathe and change his clothes. But just as he finished putting on his clothes, Huang Lin walked in impatiently. Seeing Fang Xinjian, he said, "Come with me quickly. The Imperial Capital's master has just arrived. He's going to design an Empire's divine weapon for you. Go and interact with him quickly." "Oh, right, have you thought of what kind of weapon you want during this period of time?" Fang Xinjian's eyes lit up. He had long since had enough of the practice longsword that kept on shattering. Hearing this, he said, "I've thought about it long ago." Chapter 72. As Huang Lin walked, he said to Fang Xinjian, "It seems that the association thinks very highly of you this time around, sending one of the top 10 masters in the Royal Armory, Griffin. When you speak to him later, you must be more polite. These masters may not be very strong, but their craftsmanship in creating weapons and equipment can be said to be at the peak of perfection. If you want him to put in more effort, you must be polite." "Oh, right." With that, he passed a silk bag of money to Fang Xinjian. "You don't have much savings now. Use this money to pay for your expenses." Fang Xinjian weighed the bag of money in his hand, estimating that there were about 200 gold coins in it. 200 gold. Based on his current allowance for nights, he would need to save up for 20 months without eating or drinking. Clearly, this was not a small sum of money to Huang Lin. Huang Lin had truly treated him as his personal disciple. However, looking at the bag of money in his hand, he could not help but feel that it was interesting. The methods of bribery in this world were really simple and crude. However, this was what Fang Xinjian liked. At the next second, he fell silent for a moment, thinking about what an ordinary person would want to say when they were touched. Huang Lin waved his hand and said, "There's no need to say anything else. Work hard for the rest of your life. If you can become a divine-level expert and let me, Huang Lin, teach a divine-level expert's disciple, that would be the greatest repayment to me." "I'll work hard, master." Fang Xinjian followed Huang Lin to the study. Huang Lin waved his hand and said, "You can go. I'm not willing to meet people from the Imperial Capital. I'll wait for you in the training field. Your medicinal water has been soaked in. From today onwards, you can spar with me every day. The regional selection is different from the prefectural selection. After learning killing techniques, actual combat is an extremely important part." With that, Huang Lin left, disappearing in the blink of an eye. Fang Xinjian nodded and headed for the study. A white-haired old man was already waiting there, sitting on a chair and drinking tea slowly. Seeing that Fang Xinjian had entered, he raised his eyebrows and looked Fang Xinjian up and down, as if he was judging him. He said, "Calm disposition, powerful steps, slender hands and sharp eyes. You're really a good swordsman." Then he waved at Fang Xinjian and said, "Come here, let me measure your size first." Fang Xinjian walked up and handed the bag of money to the white-haired old man. The white-haired old man seemed to have a tacit understanding. He took the bag without saying a word and stuffed it into his arms as if nothing had happened. However, just as he reached out to weigh the bag, a smile immediately appeared on his face. "I'll help you measure your body first. You can tell me what kind of weapon you want." The white-haired old man smiled and said, "By the way, my name is Griffin." The old man took out a measuring tape and started to measure Fang Xinjian's fingers, arms, and even his chest, waist, height, and other measurements as he listened to Fang Xinjian's description. Fang Xinjian had long since discussed the Empire's divine weapon he wanted with Huang Lin, and he had also heard the headmaster's description of the Empire's divine weapon. He said, "I want a longsword. Firstly, it has to be sturdy, and secondly, it would be best if it has the effect of a flexible sword. It has to be able to freely change its shape and even extend its length. Of course, sharpness is also a must. I cultivate the supreme Mistwind sword, so I hope to carve out wind prints and wind holes on the sword. When the air currents are sliced by the sword, they will be able to produce special sword cheese." After listing out a bunch of requirements, the white-haired old man nodded as he finished measuring Fang Xinjian's physical attribute. In the end, Fang Xinjian said, "Also, I hope to use the remains of a knight, first transition, or above as the main material. It would be best if the person had been in a job that controlled the atmosphere when they were alive." Griffin sized up Fang Xinjian and said, "You're someone who knows your stuff. Experts who were at the first transition and above of the knight level would usually have some success in cultivating waves and communicating with ether particles when they were alive. Moreover, under the strengthening of their waves for a long period of time, their bones would usually be as tough as steel. This was especially so with the continuous strengthening from ether particles. Even after their deaths, they would still possess some special abilities. As long as the attributes of the waves were matched well, the weapons created from such remains would usually be able to increase the prowess of the user's killing technique. However, there were not many experts who would be willing to donate their remains to the Empire for the creation of weapons. Most of the Empire's experts' remains came from external wars, and each of their remains was worth 1,000 taels of gold. Ordinary weapons and armors that were forged from precious materials and possessed all sorts of strange abilities were known as the Empire's divine weapons. And those that used the remains of a knight were known as remains divine weapons. Those made from the remains of a first transition knight were known as inferior remains divine weapons, while those made from the remains of a second transition conferred knight were known as superior remains divine weapons. There were also armors forged from the remains of divine-level experts and known as divine remains equipment. They possessed unbelievably powerful abilities and were rare treasures in the world. They were also known as divine equipment. Seeing Fang Xinjian's gaze, Griffin smiled and said, "It's basically impossible for ordinary knights to obtain remains divine weapons. However," with that, he changed the topic, saying, "Fang Xinjian, you're really lucky. Your talent is outstanding, and you've already attracted the attention of an important person. He told me to take care of you and rewarded you with the spine of a conferred knight, second transition. I'll use this spine to forge a longsword for you. It's a superior remains divine weapon." Griffin patted Fang Xinjian's shoulder and said with a hint of envy, "With the care of this important person, you'll definitely have a meteoric rise. With the support of that person, it's not impossible for you to become a divine-level expert. I'll also need you to take care of me in the future." Fang Xinjian's eyes lit up slightly, and in that instant, many emotions surged in his heart. He understood that what was to come had finally come. During this period of time, putting aside the aristocrats in Cursed, many clans and influences had tried to extend an olive branch to Fang Xinjian. However, they had all been stopped by Huang Lin and the headmaster. However, this time around, the olive branch from the imperial capital had been extended by one of the top 10 grandmasters in the royal armory. It was clear that it was very difficult to reject it. However, Fang Xinjian did not intend to reject it. In fact, it was just as he had said to Kyle. There was no such thing as a person who was completely free in this world. Even with his talent, before he became invincible, he would still need to find a strong backing. As the saying went, those who acquired knowledge in literature and martial arts had to belong to the royal family. He did not mind selling out his martial arts and future, but he had to sell it for a good price. Therefore, he asked, "I wonder which lord in the imperial capital is so generous?" Griffin said, "Come and meet him yourself." As he spoke, he took out a piece of yellowed paper from his bosom. The edges of the paper were somewhat irregular, and there was a peculiar smell of sulfur on the paper. It was unknown how many years it had been through. What was more noteworthy was that Fang Xinjian could sense that the paper was filled with an evil aura. Griffin threw out his hand, and the paper floated in the air. He knelt down and said respectfully, "Your Highness, please come." Before he finished his words, the paper in the air combusted without any fire. However, the paper did not turn into ashes. Instead, streams of flames were emitted from the paper, jumping about in the air and forming the portrait of a man. Chapter 73. The head formed by the flames was that of a man. Seeing the astonished expression on Fang Xinjian's face, he broke into a satisfied smile. "There's no need to be astonished. This is my flame clone. My real body is currently in the imperial capital, thousands of leagues away, performing a secret technique to talk to you." "Then you're Fang Xinjian? A genius who managed to transition to a windstorm sword hero in just 3 months?" The man's eyes were extremely sharp, and his squarish face looked stern, rigid, and filled with prestige. He was about 40 years old, and when he spoke, he instinctively gave off an air of being high and mighty. It was obvious that he was someone who had been in a high position for a long time. Without waiting for Fang Xinjian to reply, he continued, "I am the grandson of Deities, the son of Alexander, and the future king of Sinkota. My name is George Krieg. Are you willing to be loyal to me?" George Krieg was the current first prince of Sinkota, the first successor to the throne. Fang Xinjian's brows twitched, and he instinctively detested the other party's tone. He said, "That will depend on what price the first prince is willing to offer." The other party's tone of being high and mighty, as if everything was under his control, as if he was the center of the world, and as if he was the king of gods in the heavens, made Fang Xinjian very dissatisfied. Hearing Fang Xinjian's words, the figure in the flames frowned. "Impudent! The world is so big and is ruled by the royal family. The empire is helping you to learn, cultivate, and transition. You should be willing to die for it. As a direct descendant of the royal family, I have the ambition to unify the world through the hard work of several generations. It is only right and proper to be loyal to me. What is there for you to hesitate about?" With that, he changed his tone, saying, "You are extremely talented and outstanding. I admire you very much, which is why I ordered Master Griffin to come here and bestow upon you the remains of a conferred knight to forge a superior remains divine weapon for you. As long as you are under me, you will have all sorts of secret techniques, heavenly and earthly treasures. Even if it's the remains of Aurora Sword Spirit McDowell, the last divine-level expert who had successfully transitioned into a windstorm sword hero during the first transition, it's not like I can't take it out from the royal treasury and give it to you." Griffin, who was at the side, said, "Fang Xinjian, aren't you going to thank him? His Highness, the first prince, was the destined king, the heir to the empire. Among the 5 princes, only the first prince had fought for the empire for many years, achieving great military service. In the future, the throne of the empire would definitely belong to the first prince. Being valued by the first prince and being able to display your talents is the luckiest thing that has ever happened to you. What are you still hesitating for?" Fang Xinjian had long heard about some of the empire's powers from Huang Lin. The empire's king, Alexander Krieg, was obsessed with martial arts when he was young. He only got married and had children when he was 30 years old. He was now 80 years old and had a total of 5 princes. Amongst the 5 princes, the first prince was the strongest at second transition level 29. He was only 1 step away from attaining the divine level. In particular, his mother's clan was extremely powerful and had power over the entire court. Moreover, the first prince was the successor to the number 1 faction in the country, the ancient Path of Hell. Over the years, he had fought for the empire for many years and had an extremely high reputation in the army. He had many valiant generals under him and many strategists. He had also gathered a group of experts from the ancient path of hell. Regardless of whether it was in terms of his abilities or reputation, he seemed to be able to suppress the world. Fang Shijian frowned. Although he was displeased with the other party's tone, he knew that in a feudal country like this, the first prince's actions were already considered to be courteous. Moreover, on account of the remains' divine weapon, Fang Shijian still nodded and said, "Thank you for your appreciation, Your Highness." The first prince nodded slightly and said, "Use your finger to sign your name on it. From today onward, you'll be my trusted aide and a high-ranking official in the Empire in the future. You'll live a life of riches and glory." The flames rolled back, pushing the white piece of paper which had been floating in the air to Fang Shijian. It was obvious that it was for him to sign it. Fang Shijian frowned, feeling a sudden chill in his heart. He asked, "If I sign it, will there be any effects?" "Of course there will be effects." First Prince George said, "This is my job specialty, Devil's Book. His first requirement is that before you sign it, you must know the consequences of signing it. Only then will it be effective. This Devil's Book has a total of 32 pages, and each page can be used to sign one person. As long as you sign it, you'll have to be loyal to me from today onward. Once you go against my orders, you'll receive the punishment of having all your attributes reduced by half. Similarly, if I were to die of unnatural causes, your attributes will also be reduced by half." He looked at Fang Shijian with a gaze as if he was the king of the gods. There was both threat and temptation in his eyes. He said, "As long as you sign the Devil's Book, the remains' divine weapon is just the beginning. I'll get someone to send you the dragon's blood potion, which is made with the royal family's secret formula. It'll be enough for you to raise all your attributes to over 100 points before the prefectural selection. You'll also be able to obtain the top-notch specialty, Dragon's Tenacity. Of course, you have outstanding talent, but you're still not strong enough. I'll send out 12 of my Hell's Ghost Kings, second transition jobs, to serve you day and night. Haha, as long as you can pass next year's regional selection, I can even bestow a portion of McDowell's remains to you, allowing you to become the strongest conferred knight. Of course, you can also reject it." Saying this, the first prince's dense killing intent surged out, and he said almost without holding back, "However, if you reject me, I can guarantee that although the empire is big, there will definitely be no place for you to stay." Every time Griffin heard the first prince's reward, his body would shiver. He stared at Fang Shijian, the jealousy and envy in his eyes almost burning into flames. This was especially so when the first prince promised to bring out McDowell's remains. His pupils were dilated and his breathing quickened. How many divine remains equipment were there in the entire empire that could be made from the remains of a divine-level expert? They were rare divine equipment in the world. However, when Fang Shijian heard the first prince mention the existence of the Devil's Book, he could not help but frown. When the first prince finished speaking, Fang Shijian had already made up his mind. Seeing Griffin slowly walking behind him, and feeling the increasing temperature of the first prince's flaming head, Fang Shijian continued to circulate the Ice Age meditation art in his consciousness, and his thoughts became increasingly clear. "They've come with ill intentions." Fang Shijian looked at the first prince and Griffin, who had surrounded him from the front and back. Sensing the killing intent that they were unleashing recklessly, Fang Shijian's frown deepened. Fang Shijian said calmly, "With such good conditions, of course I'll agree." After saying that, he put out his finger and slowly extended it toward the paper of the Devil's Book. The first prince nodded with a satisfied smile on his face. Griffin heaved a sigh of relief. At least this Fang Shijian was not one of those inflexible people. As he relaxed, the muscles in his 4 limbs relaxed as well. However, at the next moment, Fang Shijian exerted force with his finger, tapping on the paper like a sword. With a soft bang, the paper of the Devil's Book was pushed back. Fang Xinjian felt as if his finger had tapped onto granite. He had wanted to tear this page of the Devil's Book apart, but it seemed that this was not possible. However, although the Devil's Book was not destroyed, the first prince let out a cry of pain. "You're courting death!" Flames exploded in the air, as if a bomb had been ignited. The flames that formed the first prince turned into a myriad of flame currents, bringing along a sulfuric smell as they gushed out toward Fang Xinjian. Fang Xinjian had already unleashed his stamina the moment he attacked. He retreated wildly, and at the same time, he slashed down across space with his hand. Suddenly, several tens of streams of sword cheese were created, tearing through the atmosphere. Under Fang Xinjian's skillful control, they were like many spirit snakes, jumping and turning in the air, and slashing toward the flames that the first prince had turned into and Griffin's body. With a bang, the sword cheese that clashed against the first prince's flames instantly shattered. The first prince then chased after Fang Xinjian mercilessly. Sword cheese surrounded Fang Xinjian's entire body, and he dashed toward the door like a whirlwind. Griffin, who had been secretly blocking the door, struck out with his fist, and the violent force brought up a strong gale, causing the flower vases and books in the room to be blown into a mess. It also completely destroyed the sword cheese that Fang Xinjian had slashed toward him. "Stop right there!" He then spread out his 5 fingers and fully activated his reduced force field, wanting to completely seal off the door. However, how terrifying was Fang Xinjian's speed. Although Griffin was a grandmaster in the royal armory, in terms of individual prowess, he was only in the middle of the first transition. After Fang Xinjian unsheathed his longsword, he continued to slash down, and over 100 streams of sword cheese surrounded his body. They were like countless white flood dragons, bringing him along as they dashed out, creating thunderous explosions in the air. With a bang, just as Griffin's reduced force field had sealed off the door, Fang Xinjian had already smashed through the door, turning into a strong gale and dashing out. At the same time, the flames in midair also chased after him. The paper from the Devil's Book darted into the flames, and the entire fire started burning violently once again. Very quickly, it continued to expand, forming the first prince's entire body. The human figure formed from flames stood 4 to 5 meters in midair, looking at Fang Xinjian, who was standing several hundred meters away, surrounded by sword cheese and atmospheric dragons. Fang Xinjian also stood there without moving, staring into the first prince's eyes. His eyes were cold, and there was no hint of fear or nervousness. The first prince's body formed from flames shook the air, and he said coldly, "Humph, very good. I'm even more interested in you now. But let me tell you in advance, none of the candidates I've set my eyes on have ever been able to escape." As he spoke, the flames on the body of the first prince's flame clone soared up by another 7 to 8 meters, as if a fire god had descended. Even the surrounding grass, trees, and buildings were emitting faint green smoke. "A genius like you must be under my control. Otherwise, you'll be a great threat to the Empire's rule. Today, I'll let you have a taste of my methods, so that you'll be completely loyal to me." However, at that moment 2 figures, one in front and one behind, stood in front of the first prince, surrounding him. George Krieg. Huang Lin gritted his teeth and said, "This isn't a place for you to act presumptuously. Even if you're a prince, you'll still have to wait for the Knight Association to come after you for attacking a knight conferred by the Empire." The first prince said in disdain, "The entire world's mountains and rivers, as well as millions of lives, will be under my control. So what if you're a mere knight? Putting aside Fang Xinjian, even the Knight Association will eventually be in my hands as well. But you, Huang Lin, it's been many years since we last met. Let me test you to see if your sword arts have improved." Chapter 74. George Krieg, with just a fire clone, you dare to be so presumptuous in my academy? The headmaster, who had always looked kind and amiable like an old man next door, was now furiously furrowing his brows. The muscles all over his body swelled up like balloons, and his eyes shone brightly. His aura was rising at an astonishing speed. This was the first time Fang Xinjian had seen the headmaster so enraged. He had also heard that the headmaster was a level 26 second transition job, the tyrant fist of the azure skies, and that his abilities might even be above Huang Lin's. However, this was the first time he had seen the headmaster display his abilities. The reason why many people did not reach the maximum level for their second transition jobs and were instead stuck at different levels was because after the second transition, they would need to put in a tremendous amount of effort and energy to level up. This was something that Fang Xinjian had yet to study in detail. Hearing the headmaster's words, the first prince could not help but frown. "Jackson, are you thinking of going against me as well?" "Going against me?" The headmaster's eyebrows and hair stood up as he laughed coldly. "George, you came to my academy and bullied my students. Even if you were to go before His Majesty, I'm not afraid of confronting you. As for this fire clone of yours, you can just leave it here." Before he finished his words, the headmaster punched out from afar. In an instant, the air exploded and the surface of the fire clone exploded. Large amounts of flames scattered and splattered in all directions. The first prince cried out in pain and bellowed furiously, "Jackson, who gave you the guts to attack the royal family?" "Ha!" The headmaster laughed maniacally. As he opened and closed his fists, they were like the main cannons of a battleship. With each punch, the atmosphere boomed and the ground cracked. Huge sparks exploded one after another on the first prince's fire clone, shattering his body continuously. "If it were your real body, I would naturally not dare to attack the royal family. But since you dare to come here with just a fire clone, do you really think that you're your father or your teacher? Let me tell you, compared to your father and teacher, your breadth of mind and abilities are more than 100 times worse. If it were them, how could they not even tolerate a windstorm sword hero?" Before he finished his words, the job specialty of the tyrant fist of the azure skies was fully activated. The reduced force field extended out to a distance of several hundred meters, and the force of each punch was transmitted to the first prince through the reduced force field. Following the terrifying bombardment of punches that were like cannons, the first prince's fire clone trembled incessantly and sparks flew everywhere. "Old man! How dare you!" The first prince's words were filled with endless sinister coldness. As his flame incarnation continued to explode, he suddenly released endless sparks and black smoke. An intense sulfuric aura surged forth, covering the sky and covering the earth. It was as if a volcano had erupted. The flames collided with the force of the headmaster's punch. With the point of collision as the center, streams of air currents would occasionally sweep out. However, the first prince managed to withstand the headmaster's attack. However, just then, streams of cold light flashed in the air. Huang Lin had unknowingly appeared behind the first prince. Sword light came out continuously, sweeping across the four limbs, waist, and abdomen of the flame clone. Killing technique. Void-cleaving longsword. Wherever Huang Lin's longsword swept past, all the sword forces were like pillars of light, condensing in midair and not dissipating, turning into a sword prison that encompassed the first prince. The four limbs of the flame clone had been chopped off. Originally, the sparks would have been able to reconnect, but now they were blocked by the sword forces condensed in the air, unable to reconnect. "Huang Lin, Jackson, do you guys want to die so badly?" The first prince's face was grim, and the flames all over his body surged. The flames continued to clash against the sword forces and fist forces, creating a series of booming sounds. However, against the combined forces of the two of them, he was gradually being suppressed. While the three experts were engaged in battle, Griffin let out a hideous laugh and dashed towards Fang Xinjian. Humph, although this lad has outstanding talent and has transitioned into a windstorm sword hero, he has only transitioned for a month. I've been transitioning for a total of 20 years. Even if I'm not very good at combat. As he spoke, he had already dashed up to Fang Xinjian. Opening his hands, the killing technique, Purgatory's Hand, exploded out. Griffin's killing technique, Purgatory's Hand, was formed by condensing endless firepower and tempering various types of metal essence. Not only did this allow his hands to be indestructible, unafraid of sabers and axes, they also emitted a high temperature of over 1000 degrees Celsius. Ordinary people would basically die upon contact with them. His hands had just gotten within 15 meters of Griffin when Fang Xinjian felt waves of heat gushing towards him, as if he had arrived at the mouth of a volcano. Circulating the Ice Age meditation art continuously, Fang Xinjian continued to maintain a calm state of mind as he faced Griffin, who was dashing towards him. Veteran First Transition. Attributes unknown. Techniques unknown. Specialties unknown. Killing technique unknown. Then let's test him out first. Grinning savagely, Griffin was about to step within 10 meters of Fang Xinjian and enter the envelopment of the reduced force field. With a swing of the longsword in Fang Xinjian's hand, a whirlwind gushed out. A part of it was like a tornado made of sabers and swords heading towards Griffin, while the other part brought his body back. A series of crisp, clanging sounds rang out, and the sword chi tornadoes were intercepted by Griffin with his bare hands. Slashes after slash landed on his hands, letting out a series of metallic clanging sounds. Lad, surrender obediently. The first prince is so magnanimous that he can still take you in as his disciple. If you continue to be so stubborn, then don't blame me for being ruthless. Fang Xinjian let out a cold snort. With each step he took, small pits would be left on the ground. The huge reactionary force pushed his body forward, and with the sword chi tornadoes circling around him, his movements became increasingly faster. He moved about 15 meters around Griffin, moving up and down at a speed as fast as a phantom. No matter how much Griffin tried to dodge left and right, he was unable to get within 10 meters of Fang Xinjian. The area within 10 meters was the location of the reduced force field. Before he could ascertain the limits of his opponent's strength, Fang Xinjian would definitely not take a step closer to his opponent's reduced force field. As he moved about, streams of air circled around him. His longsword slashed out continuously, and a series of white sword chis slashed out towards Griffin, who was dashing about wildly. With a crisp bang, the sword chis that Fang Xinjian had slashed out were once again shattered. Griffin said angrily, "Lad, do you only know how to dodge and dodge like this?" Fang Xinjian turned a deaf ear to Griffin's words and continued to move about at high speed, leaving behind a series of afterimages. The Ice Age meditation art circulated crazily in his mind, trying to determine every piece of information about his opponent. After consecutively shattering 16 streams of sword chis, his hands are starting to tremble a little. Every time he shatters 2 streams of sword chis, he needs to change hands to rest. He's panting. His reactions have slowed down, and so has his speed. This guy's strength is around 70 points. If he were to use his reduced force field, he wouldn't be able to completely capture my body. On the other hand, Griffin was getting more and more astonished. He saw that Fang Xinjian was surrounded by streams of sword chis, and regardless of whether it was his movement speed or the speed of his sword attacks, they were all like a raging storm. Griffin was gradually unable to see his opponent's sword attacks clearly. Another 10 streams of sword chis tore through the air, slashing out with a series of sharp whistling sounds. Griffin tried to block them in a flurry, but in the end, one of the sword chis changed direction halfway and brushed past his neck, leaving behind a trace of blood. This scared him half to death. Damn it, has this guy been training in the sword since he was in his mother's womb? Griffin let out a low bellow. Fang Xinjian, seeing that you're brimming with talent, I'll let you off today. You better think about joining the first prince's side. Don't choose the wrong path. After saying that, he let out a loud bellow, and his reduced force field was like an air bomb, instantly shattering the surrounding sword cheese. He was like a cheetah, dashing out in the direction of the first prince. Humph! Fang Xinjian looked coldly at the escaping griffin. In that short period of probing, he had already seen through his opponent's abilities. Strong on the outside but weak on the inside, unable to withstand a single blow. As expected, as a master in creating divine weapons, he's not good at fighting. Fang Xinjian stomped hard on the ground with both feet, creating a deafening sound and sending rocks flying in all directions. At the same time, he swept out with his longsword, and countless atmospheric dragons shot out, wrapping around his body as he dashed out. Swoosh! The air was as if a banshee was shrieking, and the atmosphere was trembling crazily. Griffin turned his head and saw that a long sword had already arrived 3 inches away from his forehead, bringing with it a cold gleam. Griffin was so frightened that his pupils instantly constricted to the size of a needle. Chapter 75. How could it be so fast? How could it be so fast? There were too many astonishment, fright, nervousness, and many other reactions in his mind. However, in the process of Fang Xinjian thrusting out his sword, Griffin did not have the time to deal with these reactions. He had already instinctively unleashed his reduced force field. As a knight, first transition, expert's most basic life-saving technique, Griffin performed it at full power at the last moment. Accompanied by the violent force shooting out in all directions with Griffin as the center, there seemed to be circles of ripples appearing in the air from Griffin's body. The air was pushed out layer by layer by the reduced force field, forming explosive shock waves. Air currents gushed forth, and Fang Xinjian felt as if the surrounding air had suddenly become extremely viscous. The reduced force field enveloped him, making him feel as if he had suddenly arrived in the deep sea. However, half of Griffin's strength was clearly not enough to stop Fang Xinjian's charge. Pushed back by the reduced force field, Fang Xinjian's longsword continued to inch closer to Griffin. The time taken for the force field to erupt and the longsword to pierce out was far too short. Just as Griffin's brain received the signals from his nerves and truly felt fear, nervousness, and astonishment, the longsword was only half an inch away from his forehead. With a bang, just before the sword pierced into Griffin, the longsword was finally unable to withstand the pressure from Fang Xinjian's physical strength, the surrounding wind pressure, and Griffin's force field. It let out a crisp sound and broke into tens of pieces, shooting out in all directions. Arg! Griffin let out an agonizing cry. One of his eyeballs had been pierced through, and fresh blood spurted out from his eye socket. He was like an injured wild beast, frantically fleeing forward. The speed of Fang Xinjian's sword was too fast. It was only then that Griffin's mind reacted. His mind was filled with the terror and astonishment of having almost been killed. Fang Xinjian stood where he was, not moving, coldly looking at Griffin's frantically fleeing figure. He took a look but did not give chase. This was because, with his longsword shattered, he had already lost the special effect of single sword world subjugation. His strength had plummeted by more than half. More importantly, a beam of fiery light shot up into the sky from his eyes. The first prince had performed some unknown secret technique, and his fire clone had directly broken through Huang Lin and the headmaster's encirclement. Carrying Griffin's body, he dashed out fiercely, disappearing from the trio's sight in an instant. Huang Lin, Jackson, this king will remember this matter. Let's meet at the association's arbitration. Huang Lin's eyes were filled with killing intent as he watched the first prince escape. At the side, Dean Jackson seemed to have returned to his benevolent grandfather appearance. He shook his head and said, "This guy's mastery of the purgatory demonic tome has become even more profound. A clone of his was actually able to escape from the two of us." Huang Lin said coldly, "That's not an ordinary clone. It's one of his 32-page Devil's Note clones. There's a total of 32 pages in the Devil's Note, and each page can condense an extraordinary clone. Not only can the clone control the person who signed on it, but it also has 10% of the first prince's powers. It's that amazing? Fang Xinjian's eyes narrowed as he asked, "What on earth is the first prince's second transition job?" "Just this specialty of being able to create clones and sign contracts is already too amazing?" Jackson let out a bitter laugh and said, "That's the ancient path of hell's second transition job, the Demon Lord. If his real body were here today, or if a few more of his clones and signees were here, we'd be the ones running." Huang Lin added, "Xinjiang, you've always felt that the Empire is the strongest faction in the world. Then do you know that the Empire's first emperor was the Ancient Path of Hell's sect master? The Ancient Path of Hell is a faction that belongs to the royal family. In every generation, the royal family will choose the two most outstanding princes. One will inherit the throne, while the other will become the Ancient Path of Hell's sect master, passing down the legacy of the sect. The first prince is considered to be the successor to the throne. Even with the wealth of the Empire's royal family, they can only produce one demon lord in every generation. As for the killing technique he cultivates, the Purgatory Demonic Tome, it's a secret technique of the Ancient Path of Hell that's not passed down to outsiders. Contains the world's most ancient secret." Fang Xinjian's eyes flickered. After hearing Huang Lin's words, it was unknown what he was secretly thinking. The headmaster consoled him, "But Xinjiang, don't worry. The Empire still has the Royal Knight Association to lead all the knights in the country. It's not up to George Krieg to cover the sky with one hand. Moreover, Lin and I aren't nameless people either. If he doesn't succeed this time around, he won't have the face to look for trouble with you personally before the regional selection. As for the small tricks, we'll hold them up for you." As expected, the headmaster and teacher also have big characters backing them up? But at the level of a conferred knight, how can he possibly be alone? Fang Xinjiang sighed inwardly, then nodded and said, "Then I'll go practice first. I haven't finished today's homework." Go ahead." Huang Lin looked at Fang Xinjiang with a gratified expression and said, "I saw your battle with Griffin earlier. Although he's not good at fighting, he's been at the first transition for many years. For you to be able to defeat him shows that you've improved tremendously over the past month. You don't have to worry about the weapon. The headmaster and I will think of something. You can go ahead first." Fang Xinjiang nodded and left. He looked at the broken sword in his hand and understood that his abilities were limited by the weapon. In fact, if not for the fact that the longsword could not withstand his strength and speed, he would have been able to stab Griffin to death earlier. Looking at Fang Xinjiang's departing silhouette, Huang Lin said coldly, "They're too quick. No matter how fast Xinjiang's growth is, it's impossible for him and us to fend them off. If we'd come a little later and Xinjiang had been forced to sign his name on the Devil's Note." The headmaster nodded and sighed, "Then it's time to contact that person. It's just that ever since he returned from his study trip, his whereabouts have been uncertain. He probably won't be able to arrive within a short period of time." "It's not just contacting him," Huang Lin said. "To think that the armory is also in the hands of the first prince. We'll have to think of another way to get Xinjiang's weapon." On the other side, the first prince's flame clone was carrying Griffin as he fled frantically. Within a few minutes, he had already dashed out a distance of over 10 kilometers. The two of them landed on the ground with a loud bang. Griffin covered his eyes and said in exasperation, that lad. I'm going to kill him." "Shut up," the first prince said coldly. Looking at Griffin, who had fallen to the ground, he felt a little impatient. Griffin was indeed an expert in forging weapons and divine weapons, but when it came to matters related to battle, he was a complete burden. The first prince's flame clone continued to shrink, and in the blink of an eye, It had already turned into the appearance of a 1-meter-tall child. He thought to himself, Huang Lin and Jackson, to think that they've caused this clone of mine to suffer a great deal of damage? But that Fang Shijian's potential is really not to be underestimated. He's only transitioned into a windstorm sword hero for a month, and he's already able to defeat Griffin? If that's the case, then all the more I can't allow him to land in the hands of others. The Armory, the Path of Hell, the Imperial Capital, and the Northern Army are all in urgent need of manpower. But if this Fang Xinjian is allowed to continue to grow, he'll also become a great threat. I can't just leave him be. A genius like this can only be in my hand. The first prince's flame eyes narrowed slightly, like two spots of dim light floating in the air. Just then, a figure dashed out from the forest. It was Kaunitz, who had been hiding from the people in the academy and had come to the vicinity to practice his sword arts. The injury on his skull had just healed, but he was too ashamed to return to the academy. Therefore, he had been training alone in the vicinity. Earlier, he had seen sparks descending from the sky and had thus chased after them to see what was going on. Seeing Kaunitz's sudden appearance, the flames that the first prince had transformed into jumped slightly, and he suddenly laughed. He had recognized Fang Xinjian. It was because Fang Xinjian was one of the countless candidates he had signed a contract with the Devil's Note. Treja's lad, as long as you give up your freedom and sign a contract with me, I'll be able to bestow you with endless power and trample on Fang Xinjian. Chapter 76. Although the battle between the first prince, the headmaster, and Huang Lin had been intense, the entire process had happened too quickly. Almost no one in the academy had noticed it. When the headmaster returned to his office, he discovered that the librarian, Manny, who had helped Fang Xinjian before, was already standing there. The headmaster asked, "Why did you think of coming to my place?" "Old man, I've been watching Fang Shijian's matter from the beginning to the end." Manny no longer had his usual glib manner. His tone was serious, his expression solemn, and his eyes filled with the vicissitudes of life. From a commoner, he relied on his talent and hard work to walk down the path. I've watched him cultivate for over 20 hours every day. I've watched him endure the supercilious looks and mockery of others. I've watched him become a windstorm sword hero. I've watched him beat up Griffin so badly that he scurried away like a rat. I feel that I can't continue to be so dispirited. Headmaster Jackson's gaze grew agitated as he looked at his son and said, "Manny, to think that, ever since you failed the regional selection over 10 years ago, you've been dispirited. To think that you'd be spurred on by Fang Xinjian and rise up once again." Manny's expression was calm as he said, "It's still too early to talk about rising up. My talent can only be considered ordinary when compared to those real monsters. But seeing how hard the kids are working, I don't wish to continue staying low. Old man, I'll need to spend some time to recover. You can hand over the library's work to someone else." All right. Headmaster Jackson broke into a satisfied smile. "As long as you don't continue to be dispirited, you can do whatever you want." At this moment, the extremely strong expert who had been clashing head-on with the first prince earlier seemed to have instantly turned into an old neighbor who doted on his son. That night, Fang Xinjian sat cross-legged in the quiet room in the villa. As he circulated the waves throughout his body, he also circulated the Ice Age meditation art at full force in his mind, continuously increasing the familiarity of his mental cultivation method. His mind was calm and cold as he continued to think about everything that had happened today. After a full 2 hours, he finally opened his eyes and let out a long sigh. The advancement of my mental cultivation method is still too slow. When there's injustice in the heart, it's hard to calm down. Fang Xinjian knew that the reason why his mental cultivation method was progressing well was because of that old lady from the Treja clan, Rebecca, and the first prince. These two fellows had given him trouble, causing the distracting thoughts in his mind to surge, but he was unable to get rid of them completely. Then, he began to think about his future path of cultivation. Right now, there were only 4 years and 2 months left to the 5-year period, and 8 months left to the next regional selection. As for the weapons, Huang Lin and the others had already gone to think of a solution. It was not his turn to care. Right now, other than mental cultivation methods and killing techniques, Fang Xinjian was self-cultivating for 24 hours a day. His Supreme Mistwind sword was already at level 18, and he believed that it would be able to reach level 20 in a few days' time. Even if the maximum level was not just at level 20, he would be able to reach it within a month. Then, it would be time for him to come up with a new cultivation plan. Teacher told me not to level up for now. This is the right strategy. With each level of the Windshadow Sword Divinity, I'll be able to increase my agility attribute by 11 points. From level 10 to level 19, I'll be able to increase my agility attribute by 99 points, raising my speed to a terrifying level. But if that's the case, when I raise my agility attribute once again, when it exceeds 180 plus, I'll need to expend over 180,000 potential points for each increment. It won't be like now, where each increment only requires 70,000 potential points for each increment. However, it was clear that Fang Xinjian would not be able to drag it on and not level up. Although Huang Lin had asked him to hold it in for a year or two, he knew his own situation well. He only had 4 years and 2 months' time, and from level 10 to level 19, ordinary nights would take an average of 1 year. Fang Xinjian had given himself half a year's time to reach level 19. So, if he wanted to reach level 19 before the regional selection next year, he would have to start working hard to level up in 2 months' time. I only have 2 months left to use a small amount of potential points to increase my attribute. I'll focus on leveling up in 2 months' time and reach level 19 of the first transition before the regional selection. Then, I'll have to think of a way to increase the amount of potential points I receive every day. Although the amount of potential points I receive every day is more than 10 times that of ordinary people, it's still too little for 2 months' time. But I've learned almost all of the nurturing techniques that the Academy has. If I want new nurturing techniques that don't repeat each other to increase my potential points, I'll have to learn sword techniques from somewhere else. Just as Fang Xinjian was deep in thought, his ears trembled slightly. He had already heard the slight vibrating sound in the air. The Supreme Mistwind sword was a sword technique that used sword techniques to control air current. Therefore, Fang Xinjian's grasp of air currents was exceptionally accurate. He exerted a little force with his feet and floated up gently as if he had lost his weight. Then, with a flash, he disappeared from the secret chamber. Outside the villa, Jack and Anthony knocked on the door. Looking at the maid who had popped her head out, Jack said anxiously, "We're looking for Fang Xinjian. It's urgent." "But the Lord is currently cultivating in the meditation room." The maid said timidly, "Lord Huang Lin has instructed that when the Lord is cultivating, no one is to disturb him. But our matter is very urgent. Do you know that tomorrow is the deadline for the registration for the interclass battle? Kaunitz hasn't been to school for a month, and I heard that he's about to be expelled. There are only 8 of us participating in the tournament. We were already at the bottom in last month's tournament, and this time around, we're still going to be eliminated in the first round. Do you know how terrible the punishment is for the bottom 3? Not only will our subsidies be deducted, our cultivation resources will also be reduced. Moreover, these rankings will have to be reported to the Empire. Once it was reported to the Empire, it would naturally enter the Knight Association's files. It would have a great impact on every knight's future. Moreover, the reduction of resources could still be taken from their families for the other aristocrats, but for Jack and Anthony, it was a huge blow. On the contrary, if they were able to achieve good results in the interclass battle, not only would they be able to get more resources, they would also be able to gain the attention of various important people in school. Of course, due to the difference in time between the transitions, it was usually very difficult for the lower year classes to win against the upper year classes. What they pursued was to win against the classes that were around the same level as them, or to have a stunning performance against the upper year classes. And now, as Class 256, which Fang Shijian was in, had lost Fang Shijian and Kaunitz, there were only a few of them, and they were young. Naturally, their performance was unsightly. "All right." Seeing the timid maid, Anthony patted Jack and said in a gentle voice, "It's not that we have to meet Xinjiang. It's just that after he's done with his cultivation, can we trouble you to tell him that we've come to look for him?" All right. I'll let the Lord know," the maid nodded and said seriously. Just then, the three of them felt a whirlwind sweeping past at the same time. As the white sword cheese dissipated in the air, Fang Xinjian's silhouette floated down from midair, gradually appearing before the three of them. Fang Xinjian said calmly, "Interclass battle?" "That's right, Xinjian." Seeing that Fang Xinjian had appeared, Jack immediately became agitated. "The first interclass battle was held 1 month after we transitioned. We've all just started learning killing techniques, and those senior students from the most recent batch have been learning for 1 more year than us. There's no way we can win against them, and we were eliminated in the first round. You've transitioned into a windstorm sword hero. This time around, you must participate in the interclass battle with us and teach those B***stards a good lesson." Anthony said, "Xinjian, if you're very busy, it's fine if you don't come. I heard from Lord Huang Lin that you're at a critical juncture in your cultivation." "Interclass battle? Sparring with other students?" Fang Xinjian stroked his chin and thought to himself, "Every student here comes from different places, and they've learned nurturing sword techniques from various factions and academies. If I can learn more nurturing sword techniques through sparring with them, I'll be able to increase the amount of potential I gain every day. However, they usually use killing techniques in their battles. I'll have to think of something else." Thinking of this, Fang Shijian's eyes narrowed slightly. Looking at the two people before him who were filled with anticipation, he said, "It's true that teacher told me to focus on my cultivation and not bother about the other matters in the academy. However, now that my killing techniques have improved, I do need to test my sword techniques through actual combat. I'll be participating in the interclass battle this time around." "That's great." Jack laughed out loud. "I was bullied so badly by those old fellows previously. Xinjian, this time around, you must help us teach them a good lesson. Ha 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 ha, you're now the trump card of our class." Anthony reminded him, "It's not that simple. Those students have all trained here for 1 to 2 years, 5 to 6 years, or even 7 to 8 years. Amongst them, there are even prefectural champions like Xinjian. Many of them have already transitioned to level 19, and some have even participated in the regional selection before. Their abilities are not to be underestimated." Chapter 77. Hearing Anthony's reminder, Fang Xinjian nodded and said, "I understand. Count me in for the interclass competition this time around." He had just finished speaking when a strong gust of wind blew past and Fang Xinjian's silhouette became increasingly faint, gradually disappearing from everyone's sight. Jack gulped and said, "Xinjian's speed is getting more and more elusive." Anthony laughed. "Isn't that even better? Although Kaunitz isn't here this time around, with Xinjian around, we should be able to hold on for a few more rounds, right?" Although the two of them already knew that Fang Xinjian was very strong, that his occupation as a windstorm sword hero was very strong, and that his talent was even stronger, they had never thought that Fang Xinjian would be able to defeat those knights at the peak of their abilities who had been training in the academy for 5 to 6 years, or even 7 to 8 years. On the other hand, Fang Xinjian had already returned to the training room to start cultivating his supreme Mistwind sword technique. Since there were only a few more days before the interclass competition, He had to make good use of his time to cultivate his killing techniques, striving to bring his supreme Mistwind sword technique to level 20 before the competition. He wondered what additional special effects it would bring. The next day, the news of Fang Xinjian registering for the interclass competition spread throughout the entire Knight Academy. Countless people were secretly anticipating what kind of power Fang Xinjian, who had transitioned into a windstorm sword hero, would be able to display. In Class 252's classroom, there were 10 people in this class who had been training for 4 more years than Fang Xinjian and the others. A tall, fair-skinned, golden-haired man laughed, to think that Fang Xinjian would be participating in the competition as well. He has always been treated like a treasure by the headmaster, and even applied for extra leave for him. Even the Knight Association has agreed to it. I had thought that he would be training in seclusion for the next year. He was the current prefectural champion of Class 252, Renault from Cursed Aristocrat Academy. Renault was half reclining on a chair, with a few aristocrat knights sitting in front of and behind him. As for the commoner knights, they were busy serving tea. As Renault spoke, he glanced at the feminine-looking man next to him. It was the man who had greeted Kaunitz on the day of the prefectural selection. He was also a knight from Tresia Academy. Renault looked at the feminine-looking man and said, "Xiao-yi, this Fang Xinjian can be considered a great foe of Tresia. Before he grows up, why don't you teach him a good lesson? I heard that Kaunitz is hiding at home now and doesn't even dare to come out. If he doesn't report to the academy like this, he'll be expelled soon, right? You don't have to worry about Kaunitz. He has received the recognition of an important person and has been specially approved by the imperial capital to not participate in the academy's daily cultivation. Instead, he is undergoing special training." The effeminate man, Xiao-yi, said. "As for Fang Xinjian, he has only transitioned a month ago. Defeating him is a matter of course, not a lesson. Moreover, whether we can meet them or not depends on the situation of the group." Currently, there were a total of 9 classes in the Knight Academy. The interclass tournament would be split into 3 groups by drawing lots in the first round. Each group would compete in 2 rounds of a round-robin tournament. A win would be worth 3 points, a draw would be worth 1 point, and a loss would be worth 0 points. The last person in each group would be eliminated. If the scores were the same, the time elapsed and the number of people eliminated in the competition would be determined. There would be a total of 6 teams left. The first and second place teams would enter the semi-finals directly. The other 4 teams would go through an elimination round. The 2 victorious teams would then compete with the teams with the first and second place points to fight for the right to compete in the finals. Hearing Xiao-yi's explanation, although Renault was extremely curious as to which important person Kaunitz had received the recognition of, and why the imperial capital had given the order to interfere with the academy, he knew that Xiao-yi would definitely not reveal it. Therefore, he smiled and said, "Class 256 is too weak. All of them are newbies who have transitioned a month or 2 ago. However, Fang Xinjian is a windstorm sword hero. Although he has only transitioned a month ago and is still very weak, with a bit of luck, he might be able to advance to the next round." Just as Renault was casually analyzing the situation, a middle-aged man with black hair and eyes ran over. His face looked weathered and his skin was tanned. Although he was wearing a knight attire, when he saw Renault and the others, he kept lowering his head and bowing, appearing out of place. This was a commoner knight who had come from the lowest rung of society. The moment he ran in, he bowed to Renault and the other aristocrats, saying, "Young Master Renault, the results of the drawing of lots are out. Our Class 252 has drawn the same group as Class 256 and Class 253. Class 256? Renault's eyes lit up. Isn't that Fang Xinjian's class? This batch of commoners are all very arrogant. This time around, I'll be able to teach them a good lesson." Saying that, he looked at Xiao-yi and said, Xiao, you can also help your Treasure Academy's people take revenge. Although you can't kill him, breaking a few of his bones shouldn't be a big deal. Xiao said calmly, aren't you afraid of offending this future divine level expert? It's not that easy to reach the divine level. If we're constantly worrying about this person becoming a divine level and that person becoming a divine level, then we can forget about fighting. Renaud smiled in disdain. Moreover, he came to participate in the competition after training for a month. If we don't teach him a good lesson, are we supposed to tie our hands up and let him win? Against the current him, it's normal for us to win. It's something we should do. What's there to offend? Xiao said in disdain, you're still afraid. Looking at the other students around him, who were also wearing unnatural expressions, Xiao Yi's expression turned even more gloomy. He said coldly, I know that none of you want to offend a windstorm sword hero. Since that's the case, leave him to me during the competition. On the other side, in the class 256 that Fang Xinjian was in, everyone was sighing. How could it be like this? Jack held his head and shouted, Class 252, Renaud and Xiao Yi's class, has been training in the academy for a total of 4 years. It's too difficult to win against them. Why can't we be matched against Class 255 and Class 254, which have been training for 1 or 2 years longer than us? Anthony analyzed from the side, it's very difficult for us to win against Class 252. Now, whether or not we can advance depends on whether or not we can defeat those fellows from Class 253. How do we fight? With what? Barbara, who was in the other corner of the classroom, looked at the two of them in disdain and said, Class 253 came 3 years earlier than us, which means that they've completed the first transition 3 years earlier than us. They've cultivated waves 3 years earlier than us, and they're killing techniques 3 years earlier than us. We're missing counts, and the two of you are burdens. I think we can only wait until next year to bully the new batch of students. Her tone was filled with disdain, obviously looking down on commoner knights. Jack retorted, unconvinced, but this time, Xinjian is participating. He's a windstorm sword hero and has unparalleled speed. With him around, we have hope of winning. So what if he's a windstorm sword hero? Barbara retorted. He's only transitioned a month ago. 1 month, do you understand? He's only been training killing techniques for a month. How strong can he become in a month's time? Even if his talent is unparalleled and he can win against 1 or 2 of them, there are 10 of them. We're still 1 short, and with the 2 of you burdens, even if he's made of steel, how many of them can he fend off? Jack's face flushed red. Although he wanted to rebut, thinking that it was because he was weak that he was a burden to the class, he was unable to say a word. However, he immediately reacted, pointing at Barbara and saying, Then can you do it? Can you win against those knights from Class 253? Barbara let out a cold laugh and said, I still have a chance of winning against the 2 weakest commoners in their class. As she spoke, she threw a glance at Jack and Anthony, her meaning clear. She continued to tease, also, not only will we not be able to win against Class 252, the person in second place in that batch is Kaunitz's senior from Treasure Academy. You guys better tell Fang Xinjian to be careful. Alright, stop quarreling. That's enough, let's go. Just as the two of them were arguing more and more intensely, Anthony pulled Jack back, while Ferdinand pulled Barbara back. However, before they left, Barbara still looked at Jack unhappily and said, Tell Fang Xinjian that although he is very strong, the interclass competition is not a one-man competition. Tell him to listen to the commands and not to act recklessly. Alright Barbara, that's enough. Ferdinand said, I'm sorry, but I'll have to trouble you guys to tell Fang Xinjian that on the day of the competition, we'll still need to coordinate well in order to win. It's really not good for someone like him to not participate in class activities. Seeing the few aristocrats leaving, Jack said indignantly, These aristocrats? Aren't they just relying on their numbers? There were a total of 5 aristocrats in Class 256. Even though Kaunitz was not around, there were still 4 experts from the aristocratic faction. Usually, they had the greatest say in the class. Anthony patted him on the shoulder and said, "All right, this is how the world works. Haven't you gotten used to it?" Just as the two of them were conversing, Robert, Tyrant Fist Dojo's dojo master, who had completed his first transition before the prefectural selection, walked over, cupped his hands towards the two of them, and said, "The two of you, please tell Fang Xinjian that I, Robert, am willing to listen to his commands during the interclass competition." After saying that, he left without waiting for the two of them to reply. Jack and Anthony looked at each other. A few seconds later, Anthony said thoughtfully, "To think that Robert actually gave in." Jack revealed an envious gaze. "This is the charm of a windstorm sword hero." Chapter 78. A few days later, it was the first day of the interclass competition. Fang Xinjian came to a halt in the training room. Looking at the level 20 Supreme Mistwind sword on his stats window, he let out a breath. It's finally done. What made Fang Xinjian satisfied was that level 20 Supreme Mistwind sword was still not at the maximum level. Other than the 3-foot sword light, it also had an additional level 20 special ability. Level 20 Supreme Mistwind sword allowed the user's understanding of sword arts and air currents to reach the pinnacle. Not only could they create all sorts of sword cheese out of thin air, they could also control cheese with swords and swords with cheese. The Academy's interclass competition was held in a canyon over 10 kilometers to the east. The entire canyon ran from north to south and was about 2 kilometers long and 1 kilometer wide. The cliffs were about 100 meters tall, and the canyon was overgrown with plants and countless small ferocious beasts. And now, countless people had already chosen the best spots on the cliffs, looking at the battlefield in the canyon. The interclass competition lasted for 4 days. The first 2 days were the group stage, with each class having 1 match each day. The third and fourth days were the elimination round. The top 2 teams in each class would enter the semifinals, while the third, fourth, fifth, and sixth teams would go through 2 matches. The top 2 teams with the highest scores in the group stage would enter the semifinals. The 5th day was the finals. The way each match was conducted was that the 2 teams would enter the arena at the southernmost and northernmost ends of the canyon respectively. At the place where they entered, there would be a small-scale fortress. As long as the team managed to take over the opponent's small-scale fortress, it would be considered as the winner. And if both teams were unable to take over the opponent's fortress after 2 hours, it would be considered a draw. The only condition for taking over the fortress was that there was no resistance from the opponent in the entire fortress. Such a competition was obviously very confrontational. However, as they were knights conferred by the country, the use of lethal attacks was prohibited throughout the entire competition. The main focus was on sparring. Even so, there would still be knights who would be severely injured in the competition every year, and there would even be knights who would die in it every few years. After all, swords had no eyes. Moreover, if one wanted to have a practical effect, they would have to take on a certain amount of risk. If knights who cultivated killing techniques wanted to improve, they would have to go through practical battles as well. And the first match today was between Fang Xinjian's Class 256 and Class 253, which was 3 years ahead of them. Because it was more difficult to defeat Renault, Xiao Yi, and the others in Class 252, most people felt that whether or not they could defeat Class 253 was the key to whether or not they could advance from the group stage. Jack, Anthony, Barbara, Ferdinand, and the others had already entered. They stood in front of the southern fortress, anxiously looking in the direction of the cave entrance. Barbara frowned and said, "Kaunitz clearly said that he wouldn't be coming, but what's with Fang Xinjian? It will start in 3 minutes. Why isn't he here yet?" "Don't worry, he will definitely come," Anthony said confidently, but he was also staring at the entrance of the cave. Just as everyone was anxiously waiting, the sound of metal colliding suddenly came from the direction of the cave entrance. It sounded like countless pieces of metal colliding together, and the sound came from afar. What's that sound? Is Fang Xinjian here? Under everyone's gaze, Fang Xinjian walked out slowly from the cave, carrying a huge wicker basket on his back. There were at least 30 or more metal longswords in the basket. They swayed and clashed with Fang Xinjian's footsteps, releasing a series of crisp sounds. Barbara frowned and asked, "What is this guy doing?" Ferdinand also looked at Fang Xinjian, puzzled. Zhou Yong and Carter both felt uneasy when they saw Fang Xinjian. Without Kaunitz as their backing, they were really afraid that Fang Xinjian would take it out on them. After all, they had maliciously slandered Fang Xinjian many times. Jack ran up and looked at the huge pile of swords in Fang Xinjian's basket. He asked curiously, "Why did you bring so many swords?" "One sword isn't enough." Fang Xinjian threw a glance at everyone, and Barbara and the others felt their hair stand on end. They immediately felt as if the blades of swords had brushed past their neck. This guy. Ferdinand was filled with both shock and fear. Looking at the expressionless Fang Xinjian, he sighed inwardly, "This guy's sword arts are getting more and more terrifying." He gave it some thought, then walked up, cupped his hands and said, "Fang Xinjian, there were some conflicts between us in the past, but they were just some misunderstandings. I hope that we can clear up the misunderstandings in the future and work hard together to win the regional selection." As he said that, he took out a square box the size of a palm from his pocket and handed it to Fang Xinjian. Fang Xinjian took the box and opened it. There were a few gold bars inside. He estimated that there were about 50 gold bars. Nodding his head, Fang Xinjian kept the box and said, "All right, I've got what you want." Barbara, who was behind Ferdinand, said angrily, "Ferdinand, what are you doing?" Ferdinand said impatiently, "We didn't have any major conflicts with Fang Xinjian to begin with. In the past, it was only on account of his friendship with Kaunitz. Now that Kaunitz has left, I don't understand why you're still holding on." Barbara was so angry that she stomped her feet. Robert and Boris, the two successors of the martial arts faction, also walked over to Fang Xinjian's side. Robert took the lead and said, "Xinjian, tell us what to do in the upcoming competition. We'll all listen to you." Robert looked at Fang Xinjian and revealed a friendly smile, no longer as arrogant and despotic as before. Carter and Zhou Yong wanted to come over and apologize, but they could not put down their pride. They were not as flexible as Robert, causing the two of them to be caught between a rock and a hard place. Seeing this, the fury on Barbara's face deepened. "What are you guys doing? Just because he transitioned into a windstorm sword hero, you guys are willing to be his lackeys?" Ferdinand's expression darkened. Barbara was scolding him as well. He said coldly, "Barbara, can't you think before you speak? You just open your mouth and bite people?" Seeing that Robert, Ferdinand, Boris, Zhou Yong, and Carter were all staring at her, Barbara's anger weakened. However, the fury on her face remained. She took in a deep breath and said, "Fang Xinjian, don't think that I'll listen to you just because you've transitioned into a windstorm sword hero. I, Barbara, am not like some people, forgetting what's right for the sake of benefits and submitting to power. Don't expect me to listen to you in this competition." However, Fang Xinjian did not say a word. He could not be bothered with Barbara, who was full of herself. He only walked to a position 100 meters away from the fortress and stabbed the longswords in the basket into the ground. "The few of you, listen up. In the competition later," as he spoke, he moved quickly, stabbing the longswords into the ground at lightning speed. Each longsword was a distance of 1 to 2 meters apart, and in the blink of an eye, they had formed a circle blocking the front of the fortress. "I alone am enough." Fang Xinjian pointed to the circle of swords formed by the longswords and said, "All of you hide behind this line. I'll beat up whoever comes out." Fang Xinjian. Barbara was the first to shout, "Are you crazy? The expressions of the others also turned grim. By doing this, Fang Xijian was looking down on them. Ferdinand's countenance was also dark as he said, Fang Xijian, we know that you're very powerful, but what you're doing is too humiliating. It's fine if you don't want to listen. Fang Xijian shook his head, waved his hand at the others, and said with a smile, then I'll wipe you all out first before heading to the competition. The reason why Fang Xijian had done this was because this way, he would be able to control the rhythm of the competition, fully spar with each and every one of his opponents, and secretly learn sword techniques as he willed. After saying this, the mental cultivation method in his mind circulated even more smoothly, as if he had broken through another obstacle. At the same time, his eyes lit up, as if streams of sword light were flashing in them. Especially when he stared at Zhou Yong, the only person in class 256 who was practicing sword techniques. His gaze was as if he was looking at food. He still remembered Tresia Academy's nurturing techniques, and there were still a few that he had yet to learn from Kaunitz. Chapter 79. On a cliff that was over 100 meters high, Headmaster Jackson and Huang Lin stood together. Cursed city lord, financial officer, tax officer, and other influential figures in Cursed were watching the competition together. They had all been invited to watch the Knight Academy's interclass competition this month. Cursed city lord was an astute and capable middle-aged man. He smiled and said to Headmaster Jackson, "Congratulations, old headmaster. You've taken in a good student. This is only the fourth windstorm sword hero since the founding of the empire. This goes to show that old headmaster has been teaching Cursed a lot. I heard that His Majesty had also praised you greatly in the imperial capital." Jackson grinned and said, "It's all because His Majesty is good at governing the country. I'm just basking in his glory." The city lord pointed to the south, to the fortress and the 7 people in front of it, and said, "Is Fang Xijian there?" Hearing that, everyone looked over, as if wanting to see if the legendary windstorm sword hero really had 3 heads and 6 arms, with a green face and sharp fangs. In fact, as important figures in the city, it was impossible for them to watch every round of the interclass competition. The reason why they had rushed over today was because they wanted to see how powerful the legendary windstorm sword hero was. Hearing that, the headmaster swept his gaze across the fortress in the south and said, Fang Xijian hasn't appeared yet." The city lord reminded him, "Haha, I heard that this Fang Xijian has just completed his job transition a month ago. Although the windstorm sword hero's speed is unparalleled, is it really alright for him to participate in the competition just like that? What if the sword has no eyes? After all, so many resources have been invested." The windstorm sword hero was the legendary first transition job. To be able to produce such a knight in his district was also a political achievement for the city lord. He was saying this because he was worried that the people in the academy would spoil things through excessive enthusiasm. If Fang Xijian were to be injured, that would not be good. And when he mentioned the word resources, he seemed to be gnashing his teeth. It was obvious that he still remembered that the headmaster had taken the wind eagle he had reared and fed it to Fang Xijian to nourish him. The headmaster waved his hands and said with a little complacency, "Haha, this lad is very dumb in other aspects, but in sword arts, he's a true genius. I'm afraid that even ordinary knights might not be his match." The city lord's eyes lit up. "Headmaster, you're so confident? Why don't we have a bet?" Hearing the words gamble, the clerk smiled bitterly. He knew very well how much his city lord loved to gamble. He wanted to remind the city lord, but Huang Lin's eyes lit up. Huang Lin rushed to say, "Then let's make a bet. I bet that Fang Xijian and the others will win this round." Both he and the dean had personally seen Fang Xijian easily defeat Master Griffin from the armory. Although Griffin was good at forging weapons, and his battle prowess could only be considered to be in the middle of the first transition, it still spoke volumes about Fang Xinjian's abilities. Moreover, Huang Lin had fought with Fang Xinjian many times, so he had a better understanding of his strength. Therefore, Huang Lin was very confident that Fang Xinjian's class would be able to win this match. As long as their class did not make any major mistakes and the others defended the fort, Fang Xinjian would be able to use the Windstorm Sword Hero's high-speed guerrilla attacks to defeat his opponents one by one. Then, victory would be a piece of cake. Hearing Huang Lin's words, everyone present was taken aback, especially Cursed City Lord. His face revealed an expression of interest. In Fang Xinjian's batch, most of them have only transitioned for 1 or 2 months. Other than Robert, they are all newbies at the night level, and there's still one person missing. If they can still win against 10 experienced knights, wouldn't it be a little exaggerated? The city lord gave it some thought and said, since that's the case, I bet that Fang Xinjian and the others will lose. Huang Lin said, all right, if I win, can I ask the city lord to part with the knight's remains that we bought last year? The city lord was stunned for a moment, secretly hating this old man. It's not enough for him to take my wind eagle, and now he's eyeing my remains? This set of remains was a precious treasure that the city lord had bought from overseas with great difficulty. It was the arm bone of a conferred knight, second transition. He had planned to find an opportunity to get the masters in the armory to make it for him, so that it could be passed down to his son and grandson. The headmaster looked at this scene with a smile, making it impossible for others to tell what he was thinking. This also made Cursed City Lord hesitate. Huang Lin said, City Lord, are you not willing to part with it? Then I'll add some more chips. I bet that Fang Xinjian and the others will be able to defeat their opponents within half an hour. If I lose, then this longsword in my hand will be yours. With that, he drew out the black iron longsword at his waist. Waves of ether particles kept on emitting from the longsword. As Huang Lin's personal weapon, this longsword was also an Empire's divine weapon forged by the royal family's armory. Although it was not forged from the remains, the material it was made from was also worth a lot of gold. It was mixed with mithril, adamantine, and other rare materials, and could communicate with ether particles to form a force field that could increase the user's speed and agility by about 10%. This was clearly a top-notch Empire's divine weapon. 10% of the difference in strength and agility could often change the direction of a battle. Hearing Huang Lin's words, a hint of interest flashed in Cursed City Lord's eyes. He stroked his chin and suddenly smiled. All right, I'll bet with you. But the bet between the two of us is a little too little. Is there anyone else who wants to participate? In an ordinary interclass competition, each round would take up to 45 minutes or more. To end it within 30 minutes, it would require a complete one-sided victory. Although Cursed City Lord had guessed that a Windstorm Sword Hero would be very powerful, he did not believe that a Windstorm Sword Hero who had only transitioned for a month would be able to defeat someone who had transitioned for 3 years. Hearing that, Huang Lin let out a long sigh. Xinjian, it's up to you whether or not you can get this big gift. Just then, another person stood up and said, how about I join as well? That person's white hair was combed neatly, and he was dressed in a well-ironed tailcoat. It was Treja Clan's clan head, Kaunitz's father. Nodding at the city lord and Huang Lin, he smiled and said, Fang Xinjian is indeed Cursed's pride, but he is still too young. It has only been a month since he transitioned. Although the Windstorm Sword Hero is very powerful, he is still too young. I'll bet that he will only be able to win after 40 minutes. Let's use our Treja Clan's body tempering ointment for a year. Huang Lin's brows twitched. He knew that the Treja Clan's body tempering ointment was good stuff. It contained the essence of many medicinal herbs and ferocious beasts, and was a secret of the Treja Clan. Kaunitz's attributes, which were higher than ordinary people's at the age of 16, and Rebecca's ability to grind out over 100 attribute points at level 19 of the first transition, were all closely related to this body tempering ointment. Treja clan's clan head could see Huang Lin's confidence, and obviously wanted to grant his wish. He did not wish to make enemies with Fang Xinjian, Huang Lin, and the others, and was here to ask for peace. Just then, another person walked out. It was a middle-aged lady with a crescent moon tattoo on her face, dressed in revealing clothes. She threw a glance at Huang Lin and said, "Old Huang, aren't you looking down on us from the Netherworld Valley too much?" The prefectural champion of Class 253, who was about to fight against Fang Xinjian, was a disciple of the Netherworld Valley. Huang Lin said in disdain, "When Claude was in the Netherworld Valley, he was not valued at all. His forte has never been poison art." Tina shouted, "That's the foundation that our Netherworld Valley has built for him. Do you know how much we've invested in him to give him a physique like that of a ferocious beast?" Seeing this lady from the Netherworld Valley, everyone present subconsciously took a step back. It was because the people of the Netherworld Valley specialized in barehanded and poison art. No one knew when they would be able to poison the air, water, or weapons. They were the most frightening and the most reassuring. This lady by the name of Tina was an elder of the Netherworld Valley, and was famous for being a troublemaker. She shouted, "I don't care about Windstorm Sword Hero or not. I'm betting that Fang Xinjian's team will lose an hour later. I'll bet 100 sets of our Netherworld Valley's antidote. Our antidotes can cure 90% of all poisons in this world." A pale-faced old man with a cold expression said, "Tina, you're so confident, but you're still betting an hour." She grinned. "I know he can run fast, so I'll bet 40 minutes for him to lose, and the remaining 20 minutes for him to run." Humph. The pale-faced old man was the founder of Cursed Aristocrat Academy, as well as Ferdinand's teacher in the academy. He was a veteran representative of Cursed Aristocrats, Houston. He said, "My favorite disciple, Ferdinand, is also in Fang Xinjian's team. Of course, I hope that they'll win. But they're still young. Even with the Windstorm Sword Hero, it'll still be a little difficult for them to win. I'll bet on a draw. I'll bet on my manor in the north of the city." "Draw?" Tina reacted in an instant, letting out a strange cry and saying, "You sly old man. The Windstorm Sword Hero can run fast, and as long as Fang Xinjian focuses on harassing him, he'll definitely have the chance to draw." Houston smiled, looked at Cursed City Lord and asked, "I wonder how the City Lord would like to bet?" At that moment, in the south, Fang Xinjian came out. "Oh, is that Fang Xinjian? What's that on his back?" They were too far away from Fang Xinjian and the others, and could not hear the conversation between Fang Xinjian and the others. They only saw that after Fang Xinjian had stabbed all of his longswords into the ground, he seemed to be in a standoff with his teammates. Fang Xinjian shook his head, waved at the others, and said with a smile, "Come, I'll wipe you guys out first, then head to the competition." The next moment, his eyes shone brightly, and the ground under his feet was suddenly broken by a huge force. With a flash, he appeared before Barbara. Barbara only had time to turn her body slightly, her hand reaching for the bow on her back. But in the next moment, Fang Xinjian had already appeared and knocked her out with the sword hilt. "Stop! Fang Xinjian! Are you crazy?" Ferdinand, Jack, Robert, and the others bellowed in unison. Other than Anthony, Jack, and Robert, the others attacked with their spears, fists, palms, and swords, surrounding Fang Xinjian from all directions. Chapter 80. Ferdinand was a top student from Cursed Aristocrat Academy, and was most proficient in the spear arts that the Aristocrat Academy had meticulously developed. Carter was also from the Aristocrat Academy. Although his attributes and spear arts were slightly weaker than Ferdinand's, the fact that he had been able to become a knight spoke volumes about his abilities. Zhou Yong was also from Treja Academy, just like Kaunitz, and his cultivation was also focused on sword art. Boris was like a savage from the mountains. He was from the Shadow Moon Academy, a genius whose talent was close to that of Kaunitz, Ferdinand, and Barbara. He was proficient in all sorts of bare-handed fist and palm technique. Right now, all four of them were knights, and all of them possessed reduced force fields. Now that they had attacked in unison, the turbulent and violent force fields came crashing over like waves, compressing the surrounding air to the point that it kept on emitting explosive sounds. Not only that, in a moment of desperation, almost all of them had performed their killing technique. Ferdinand's long spear trembled continuously, creating a myriad of spear shadows. It was unknown how many illusions had been created in that instant. The spear in Carter's hand seemed to have turned into a huge python, trembling crazily. The tip of the spear brought with it streams of electricity, smashing toward Fang Xinjian's head like lightning. Zhou Yong and Boris surrounded Fang Xinjian from the left and right respectively. The long sword in Zhou Yong's hand shone with a piercing light, like the sun in the sky, shooting toward Fang Xinjian's face. Boris slapped out with one palm, and his palm seemed to instantly double in size. Amidst the whistling strong winds, his palm carried an extremely heavy and condensed feeling, slapping down toward Fang Xinjian with the weight of Mount Tai. The four of them attacked at the same time. Even though their abilities were only at the level of new knights, their combined attacks were still extraordinary. They seemed to have locked down every inch of space around Fang Xinjian. 4 streams of reduced force fields pressed down on Fang Xinjian's body, as if gravity had instantly increased by several fold. However, faced with the combined attacks of the 4 of them, Fang Xinjian only smiled coldly. With a dash, he had already passed Ferdinand's spearhead and was now standing face to face with them. What? Ferdinand was almost taken aback by the sudden appearance of Fang Xinjian. Before he could react, the long spear in his hand had already broken into a few pieces. Following that, Fang Xinjian pushed out with his hand and his entire body was sent flying by a huge force. Meanwhile, Fang Xinjian's left foot stomped heavily on the ground. Dust flew everywhere and rocks cracked. Pushed by the berserk force, he crashed into Boris's embrace. There was an explosive boom, and Boris was still in the same position as when he had struck out with his palm. However, when his entire body was rammed by Fang Xinjian, it was as if he had been struck by lightning. A series of explosive sounds rang out from all the bones and muscles in his body, and he was sent flying like a pile of mud. His chi and blood were shaken, and he could not even get up. It was only at this moment that Carter and Zhou Yong finally reacted to Fang Xinjian's actions. Carter's spear trembled as he let out a strange cry and retreated. However, before he could even take 2 steps back, he felt a black shadow enveloping him. Fang Xinjian had caught up to him. Ah! At this critical juncture, he let out an enraged bellow and went all out with his reduced force field. The long spear in his hand was surrounded by electricity, and like an electric dragon, it pierced out fiercely. The electricity was like a dragon, and all the muscles and bones in Carter's body tensed up. The ground under his feet sunk down like mud, and he mercilessly used the Earth's reaction force on his body, passing through his waist, shoulders, arms, and other parts of his body. In the end, it gathered together with Carter's spiritual aura and melded into this spear, piercing out fiercely toward the black shadow. The instant the spear pierced out, Carter felt as if his mind had gone blank, as if he had lost all his strength. However, he was not shocked but delighted. It was because he felt that this spear attack was the pinnacle of his life, an unprecedented breakthrough. However, at the next moment, a majestic force came from the body of the spear. If the long spear in Carter's hand was said to be an electric dragon, then this majestic force was like a god descending to the mortal world, grabbing onto the body of the dragon and suppressing it fiercely. The long sword in Fang Xinjian's hand clashed fiercely with the body of the spear, and then the long sword pressed down on the body of the spear, suppressing the spear completely. Fang Xinjian had already arrived before Carter without any hesitation. A soft bang rang out. Carter had yet to react to whether Fang Xinjian had used his hands or feet, or even where he had been hit. He had already been sent flying, rolling on the ground like a gourd. Up until the moment he was sent flying, his mind was still filled with disbelief. How is this possible? That spear attack of mine from earlier could even pierce a hole through the city walls? How could it be broken just like that? Zhou Yong also saw this scene of his divine heart being agitated. In the blink of an eye, he was the only one left out of the 4 people who had surrounded him. His long sword, which he had been thrusting out, came to an abrupt halt. He looked at Fang Xinjian, who was standing there, not knowing what to do. Fang Xinjian waved his hand and said, "Come. I've intentionally left you for last." Zhou Yong's face twitched as he held back the fury and fear in his heart and said, "I admit defeat, I admit defeat. Is that all right?" The corners of Fang Xinjian's lips curled up slightly. Stroking the long sword in his hand, he said, "No. With me, it can only end when I say it's over." The next moment, he appeared beside Zhou Yong with a flash like a phantom. He did not use the killing technique of the Supreme Mistwind sword, but just used ordinary sword moves, slashing out towards Zhou Yong. Zhou Yong struggled to fend off Fang Xinjian's seemingly casual but actually lightning-like moves. Jack, Anthony, and Robert stared dumbfoundedly at the scene of devastation. They looked at Ferdinand, Carter, and Boris, who had fallen to the ground and were vomiting blood, still unable to get up. They exchanged a glance, secretly rejoicing that they had not dashed out earlier. In fact, they had just transitioned not too long ago, and most of their attributes were between 30 to 40. How could they possibly be a match for Fang Xinjian? Putting aside killing techniques and boundaries negation, just based on attributes alone, Fang Xinjian would be able to crush them. On the cliff, Cursed City Lord laughed out loud. "Interesting, really interesting. Didn't you guys ask me how we're going to bet? This Fang Xinjian has already broken both his arms before the fight has even started. He's really arrogant and adorable. I'll bet that he'll definitely lose within 20 minutes. This way, each of us will have different bets, and whoever makes the right bet will be able to get everyone else's bet." Netherworld Valley's Tina's countenance was grim as she said, "Is this Fang Xinjian an idiot? He's already lost half of his men before the fight has even started? No, this can't be decided. He's going against the rules. I'm not betting anymore." Although Fang Xinjian's performance was very astonishing, his opponent was just a newbie who had only transitioned 1 to 2 months ago. He had not even used the Supreme Mistwind sword or boundaries negation before winning. Therefore, he did not have any astonishing abilities. On the other hand, with only 3 teammates left before the fight had even started, everyone present did not think that Fang Xinjian could still win. Are you thinking of going back on your words?" Cursed City Lord let out a cold snort and said, "Headmaster Jackson, did Fang Xinjian go against the Academy's rules?" The headmaster smiled bitterly and shook his head. "In the canyon, other than killing moves that are not allowed to be used, you can do whatever you want." "Then did he go against the rules of the competition?" This time around, the headmaster's tone was even more bitter. "There's no rule that forbids one from attacking one's own people." The people who had set the rules of the competition in the academy would never have thought that there would be people who would intentionally attack one's own people during the competition. "That's it then." Cursed City Lord smiled in satisfaction. "Since he did not go against the rules from the beginning to the end, then the bet will still stand. Don't you agree?" As he spoke, an overwhelming pressure pressed down fiercely toward Tina. This was a conferred knight, second transition, expert from Cursed City. Chapter 81. Cursed City Lord let out a snort and said, "Since no one has any objections, let's continue watching the competition." Tina from the Netherworld Valley gritted her teeth, wanting to rebut but not daring to open her mouth. The headmaster threw a glance at Huang Lin, who looked at Fang Xinjian confidently. Amongst these people, he had been sparring with Fang Xinjian almost every day. He was the only one who truly understood how strong Fang Xinjian was now. Fang Xinjian's talent was almost like that of a monstrous genius, and ordinary knights had no chance of winning against him. If not for this, how could he have taken the initiative to make the bet with Cursed City Lord? In another 2 years, when Xinjian reaches level 19, all the knights in the first transition, including those old monsters with years of experience, will no longer be a match for him. Looking at Huang Lin's confident smile, the headmaster frowned, but did not say anything to stop Cursed City Lord. Zhou Yong, on the other hand, felt as if he had sunk into a hell-like state of cultivation. Each time he struck out with his sword, each time he blocked a move, he would feel a flash of sword light, and suddenly, the tip of a sword would pierce into his body, as if it had sliced through space. Streams of reduced force field's power stuck onto his body like countless spiderwebs, causing his strength to be depleted crazily within a few minutes. He felt as if he had entered the deep sea, and with each step he took, he had to break through layers of pressure, depleting a lot of his physical strength. Unknowingly, the light on the tip of his sword was no longer there. He no longer had enough physical strength to continue performing killing technique. If he were to forcefully perform them, not only would they be useless, they would also damage his foundations. His radiant light sword technique used waves in conjunction with sword techniques to produce sword light to confuse the enemy. When trained to a high level, he could even use ether particles to produce sword light with destructive power. Even sword light could kill, and it was a perfect match for his waves and mental cultivation method. However, although killing techniques were powerful, they also depleted physical strength. If one were to forcefully perform them without sufficient physical strength, it would cause damage to the body, and even cause irreversible damage to the practitioner's foundations. In a situation where one's physical strength was insufficient, it would be difficult to perform waves and mental cultivation methods. After all, when one was so tired that one could not even stand up and could fall asleep with just one's eyes closed, how would one be able to control one's breathing and blood flow? How would one be able to maintain the various thoughts of mental cultivation methods in one's mind? And to Fang Xinjian, Zhou Yong was simply too weak. Fang Xinjian had only exchanged over 10 blows, and then used his reduced force field to continuously deplete his opponent's physical strength, causing him to be unable to perform any more killing technique. With his stamina depleted, Zhou Yong could only perform nurturing sword techniques that would not harm his body and would strengthen his foundation. Seeing Zhou Yong clumsily executing Treasure Academy's nurturing techniques, the corners of Fang Xinjian's lips curled up slightly. Zhou Yong did not notice the changes in Fang Xinjian at all. In fact, he could not even react in time. He could not even see Fang Xinjian's silhouette clearly. He only felt that his opponent's sword attacks were like a raging storm enveloping him, with long swords piercing through every inch of space in all directions. He was like a small boat in a storm, desperately fending off his opponent's attacks, not even having the time to say a single word. Compared to Zhou Yong, who was struggling to hang on, Fang Xinjian was much more relaxed. He casually brandished his sword techniques, sensing the changes in Zhou Yong's sword techniques through each collision, and trying to guess his opponent's sword techniques. It was a pity that Zhou Yong and Kaunitz were both from Treasure Academy, and Fang Xinjian had already secretly learned most of the sword techniques he had performed from Kaunitz. However, back then, Kaunitz had not performed a few nurturing techniques. This time around, Zhou Yong had performed all of them. And now, what level had Fang Xinjian's sword arts cultivation reached? A total of 31 sets of nurturing techniques, almost all of them at level 20 or level 30. This allowed him to be said to have reached the pinnacle of nurturing techniques, reaching a terrifying level. This also allowed him to learn at an extremely fast speed. It was as if after Zhou Yong had performed 1 or 2 moves, not only would he be able to learn them immediately, he would even be able to deduce the other moves of this sword technique. It was only then that Fang Xinjian realized how terrifying his sword arts talent was. Although his speed of picking up sword techniques was already very fast, he was still a newbie after all. The amount of time he had spent learning the sword was too short, and his understanding of sword arts, sword theories, and the human body were too little. This had caused his talent to be unable to be fully unleashed. But now, Fang Xinjian knew 31 sets of nurturing techniques alone, and had even picked up training techniques, integrating sword arts into wave. He had even picked up a killing technique like the Supreme Mistwind sword. How astonishing was his experience in sword arts! If he were to turn around and pick up those basic nurturing techniques, he would be able to master them in one go. Just by casually sparring with Zhou Yong, he had already learned most of them. One could only imagine how fast his speed of picking up these sword techniques would be. My talent will probably be able to display even more astonishing effects as my level of sword arts and experience in sword arts increases. A hint of understanding flashed in his mind, and Fang Xinjian also picked up 2 sets of nurturing techniques from Zhou Yong that he had not been able to pick up from Kaunitz back then. With a crisp clang, the long sword in Zhou Yong's hand flew out of his hand, falling onto the ground. It was as if he had expended the last bit of his energy in that instant. He sprawled on the ground, panting heavily. He struggled to lift his head, and saw that Fang Xinjian had his eyes closed in concentration, as if he was thinking about something. Very soon, he sat down cross-legged, and no one knew what he was doing. Suddenly, a column of smoke rose up from the cliff. Zhou Yong opened his eyes wide and looked over, feeling bitter. He suddenly shouted at Fang Xinjian, who was sitting quietly with his eyes closed. "Fang Xinjian, you be **starred. Are you crazy? I'm going to lose again. It's all your fault." Zhou Yong was cursing non-stop, but Fang Xinjian ignored him completely. He had already started to wholeheartedly organize the 2 sets of nurturing techniques he had just picked up in his mind. He then discovered that by practicing these sword techniques in his mind, he was able to increase his proficiency in them. Although it was not as much as when he was practicing with his body, it had already far surpassed the proficiency gained by ordinary people when they were practicing sword arts. As expected, as my sword arts cultivation continues to grow stronger, the effects of my talent will also become stronger and stronger? With that, he completely ignored Zhou Yong's curses and focused on practicing his sword techniques in his mind. On the other side of the cliff, Cursed City Lord laughed. "Huang Lin, this disciple of yours is really interesting. He can clearly defeat his opponent with a single sword attack, but he likes to slowly tease his opponent, like a cat toying with a mouse. Furthermore, his opponent is a teammate from the same class. He's really vile." The others at the side also nodded in agreement. Who would have thought that Fang Xinjian would be able to pick up his opponent's sword techniques in such a short period of time? They all thought that Fang Xinjian had a vile character. Netherworld Valley's Tina looked towards the north and said, the other team has also started to move. Damn it, why are they so fast? Slow down." At this moment, Tina regretted even more that she had bet on Fang Xinjian's team to be able to hold out for an hour. Cursed City Lord laughed out loud. "I think they'll be able to finish the battle in 15 minutes. Chapter 82. Naturally, those who had also come to watch the competition were not only the leaders from the city and the academy. On the other side of the cliff, Class 252's Renault and Xiao Yi stood on the cliff with their heads held high. Behind them were a few aristocrats, and behind them were some commoner knights who were bowing to them. Seeing that Fang Xinjian had first wiped out Barbara and the other 4, who were on the same side as him, Renault laughed out loud. "This Fang Xinjian is really interesting. Very interesting. When we fight him tomorrow, I must have some fun with him." "Interesting." Xiao Yi's gaze was cold as he said, "There are only 2 possibilities for him to do this. One is that he has already given up on the competition, and the other is that he feels that even with 5 less people, he will still be able to win. Renaud stroked his chin and said, although Class 253 is 1 year behind us, if I, the prefectural champion, were to go up against them, along with that blockhead from their class, it would still be a little difficult for me to wipe them out. It seems that this Fang Xinjian thinks that he has abilities that are about the same as mine? Xiui said expressionlessly, who knows? Most of the knights who have just transitioned and practiced killing techniques will have some misconceptions that they shouldn't have due to the great improvement in their abilities, thus making them underestimate their own abilities. As for whether Fang Xinjian is being too arrogant, or if he has really become as strong as you in just a month of training, we'll find out soon enough. 1 month of training is equivalent to 4 years of training. Renaud licked his lips, revealing an excited expression. If that's really the case, then it'll be even more interesting. Only by defeating such a genius will one truly be excited. Just as everyone was astonished by Fang Xinjian's actions, at the other end of the battlefield, in front of the fortress belonging to Class 253, 10 knights in knight attire had already finished their preparations. The man in the lead was terrifyingly tall, with a height of 2.5 meters. Just his forearm alone was as thick as an ordinary person's waist, and he looked like a huge King Kong that looked like a human. He was the leader of Class 253, the champion of the prefectural selection 3 years ago, Claude. He was a freak with extraordinary talent. Although he had started out as a commoner, he had been born with 4 innate specialties. Although he had lived in the Yellow Springs Valley since he was young, he had never practiced the poison art there. His physique, on the other hand, was extremely abnormal. Not only was it natural, but it was also nourished by countless poisons and tonics in the Yellow Springs Valley since young. He had just reached level 19 this year, but all 5 of his attributes had already exceeded 70 points. Moreover, due to the existence of 4 innate talents, his stamina was long, and he was immune to poison. He also had extraordinary strength. Even his stratum corneum was as thick as rhinoceros skin. Ordinary blunt blows were almost completely ineffective against him. He was born to be a fierce general on the battlefield. Coupled with his death whirlwind class, he could be said to be a meat grinder on the battlefield. A cruel smile appeared on his tanned face as he licked his teeth and said, "Everyone, the reason why so many people have come to watch the competition today is to see that windstorm sword hero. A little B** starred who has just transitioned a month ago wants to ride on our heads and take a dump. But that's fine too. There are so many big shots watching. As long as we perform well enough, we can sell ourselves for a good price when we leave the academy in a few years." With that, he raised the 2 short axes in his hands, one on the left and one on the right, and bellowed, "Ha ha ha ha, all of you, attack! I'll take responsibility for breaking that windstorm sword hero's legs." Seeing Claude charging out alone like a tank, the other members exchanged glances and shook their heads helplessly. An archer sighed and said, "I knew it." A blue-haired knight holding a longsword smiled and said, "Since you know, why are you sighing?" Charging around recklessly, using the absolute difference in power to crush the opponent. Isn't this boss style all along? The other members also laughed. Clearly, compared to Class 252, which Renaud and Xiui were in, Class 253, which Claude led, did not seem to differentiate between aristocrats and commoners. They also got along more harmoniously. All the members followed the blue-haired swordsman's instructions. The blue-haired swordsman smiled and said, "Do you guys still remember? 3 years ago, when we had just started participating in the interclass competition. Of course." A man in a cloak, who was darting about in the shadows, said, "We were tortured for a year. If not for the fact that there's a new batch, we would have been tortured to death." The blue-haired swordsman smiled and said, "Fang Xinjian, huh? As a windstorm sword hero, Do you have any way to reverse this situation? Because of the absolute difference in power brought about by time, do you have any way to overcome this? As they advanced, they did not see any enemies at all. The blue-haired swordsman stroked his chin and said, "It's just as I thought." Rather than taking the initiative to be eliminated, they chose to defend the fortress? Because of the absolute difference in power, they want to drag it out at the fortress, relying on their geographical advantage to fight, or even drag it out to a draw. After advancing for another minute, although the blue-haired swordsman had an idea of the opponent's battle strategy, he continued to instruct his team members in an orderly manner, advancing at a steady pace. Along the way, he continued to scout according to the usual battle strategy. However, until they reached the fortress, they did not meet with any attack. What's going on? The leader should have arrived, right? Why aren't there any sounds of battle? They had long gotten used to their leader, Claude, charging into the enemy's group like a rhinoceros, turning the place upside down. They would then surround and annihilate their opponents from the back. However, there seemed to be something wrong with the battle situation today. When they reached the fortress, they saw Claude, who was 2.5 meters tall and looked like a small giant, standing there in a daze. The blue-haired swordsman threw a glance in the direction of the fortress, and his pupils contracted slightly. He said with a little uncertainty, Hey, Claude, did you do this? How long has it been, and you've already gotten rid of the 5 of them?" The small giant, Claude, shook his head. "I didn't do it. Be careful, don't move first." Hearing this, everyone was slightly taken aback. They all knew that among Claude's innate specialties, there was one called wild beast's intuition. He could sense the presence of danger and killing intents, and was extremely sensitive. Relying on this, they had gotten through many difficulties. However, this was the 3rd time that Claude spoke in such a serious tone. Just then, Zhou Yong's curses rang out once again. "Fang Xinjian. You be ****. What are you guys still looking at? Quickly beat this guy to death and you'll win. Go on. Push down this fortress. We've all surrendered." Hearing Zhou Yong's curses, everyone in Class 253 was slightly stunned. The blue-haired swordsman frowned and said, "Internal strife? Or is it a trap?" Just as the people in Class 253 were feeling extremely puzzled, Fang Xinjian, who had been sitting cross-legged and cultivating, suddenly trembled slightly. Like a willow leaf, he floated up and landed on the ground. There was a calm smile on his face, and his eyes seemed to be open but not quite open, as if they contained countless secrets. He raised his finger and pointed at the people in Class 253 one by one. Claude spat out a mouthful of saliva and laughed savagely. "You're that lucky guy who transitioned into a windstorm sword hero? What the hell are you guys up to?" "Nothing much. The few on the ground have nothing to do with you guys." After Fang Xinjian pointed at the last person as if he was counting, he smiled and walked over, saying slowly, "Other than the 4 who use swords, the rest of you can leave first." Before he finished his words, Fang Xinjian's silhouette suddenly disappeared. An unprecedented killing intent instantly filled Claude's entire body. He let out a furious bellow, letting out a cry like that of a tiger or a lion on the verge of death. The 2 axes in his hands had already slashed forward fiercely. Chapter 83. Clang. A loud sound, like that of the evening drum and morning bell, rang through the entire valley in an instant, startling countless birds and causing them to fly up into the sky, creating a scene of chaos. The twin axes in Claude's hands clashed fiercely with Fang Xinjian's longsword. Amidst the loud sound, Fang Xinjian was sent flying, only coming to a stop 100 meters away. His strength was only slightly over 50, a far cry from Claude's strength of over 70. However, Claude was the one who was truly shocked. On his slightly slanted cheek, a bloody gash had slashed open his entire cheek. Fresh blood spurted out, staining his entire face. Of course, although this injury looked serious, It was actually just an ordinary scratch. What truly shocked Claude was the other party's speed. "Damn it!" Claude shouted. "Don't scatter, stay together! His speed is too." Before Claude could finish his words, Fang Xinjian's silhouette had already disappeared once again. With a series of kacha-kacha sounds, the air was torn apart like a piece of cloth. Before a female knight who was holding onto a long spear could react, Fang Xinjian had already slapped the back of his sword. However, unlike Barbara and the rest who did not react at all, when faced with Fang Xinjian's rapid attacks, at least 3 people in Class 253 reacted in an instant. As for the female knight who was attacked, although she spat out a mouthful of blood, she still had not completely lost the ability to fight. The one who retaliated the most fiercely was Claude. With a loud bellow, the muscles all over his body swelled up, and he seemed to have grown a size larger once again. A flying axe flew out of his hand, and like a black bolt of lightning, it slashed towards Fang Xinjian with the force of a thunderbolt. With Claude's strength, this flying axe strike would be able to split an eyeball in half even if it was protected by a steel shield. At the instant the flying axe was thrown, 2 other killing intents locked onto Fang Xinjian. An archer drew his bow and nocked an arrow. His movements were like flowing water, and his eyes were fixed on Fang Xinjian's brow ridge, chest, and thigh. The other cloaked man, who was shrouded in a black shadow and wielded a dagger, was extremely fast. With a dash, he arrived 10 meters behind Fang Xinjian. The dagger in his hand glowed with a poisonous green light as it stabbed towards Fang Xinjian's kidney. Faced with the trio's attacks, Fang Xinjian let out a light laugh. With a sweep of his sword, strong gales gushed forth. The supreme Mistwind sword was already out. The female knight, who had just spat out a mouthful of blood, was struck in the stomach by an atmospheric dragon and fainted. The flying axes were hit by dozens of sword chi and were deflected. The archer only saw a blur before his eyes. Amidst the strong gales, Fang Xinjian's silhouette was nowhere to be seen. The cloaked man tightened his grip on his dagger, clashing fiercely with Fang Xinjian's longsword. Then, after a series of lightning-fast sword attacks, the cloaked man flew out as if he had been pushed by Fang Xinjian's longsword. "Damn it!" Claude only had time to say this before he dashed out like a rhinoceros. Simultaneously, with a wave of his hand, the axes that had flown out earlier flew back to him with a spin. His pair of axes were the Empire's divine weapons. Other than being sharp and sturdy, they could be connected by ether particles within a range of 100 meters and then fly back to his hand. However, as he dashed out, he felt that Fang Xinjian and the cloaked man were getting further and further away from him. No matter how hard he tried, he was still unable to close the distance between them in the slightest. He bellowed, "Lars! Willis!" The 2 archers knocked their arrows at the same time. However, amidst the strong gales, they could only see 2 shadows flashing about. They could not even tell which was which, let alone aim properly. On the other hand, the cloaked man's heart was filled with astonishment. He was already the person in the team who excelled the most in covert operations, scouting, and lightning battles. However, the moment Fang Xinjian made his move, he felt as if he had been drawn into a violent storm. There were sword light coming from all directions, and streams of sword chis formed from white air currents were all around him. As he ran, he tried his best to fend off the attacks. There were a few times when he wanted to stop and join up with Claude and the others who were chasing after him. However, Fang Xinjian's violent attacks gave him no chance to stop at all. With a bang, he had unknowingly received a kick on his foot and was sent flying. He rolled on the ground for an unknown number of meters, feeling as if his entire body had fallen apart and he was unable to stand up. Fang Xinjian turned around and swept out with his sword. In an instant, over 100 streams of sword chis continued to dance around him. He looked like an emperor in the atmosphere, even floating slightly, half an inch off the ground as he looked at Claude and the others. Fang Xinjian said softly, 8 left. This guy. Claude's eyes widened in fury, staring at Fang Xinjian's indistinct silhouette amidst the tempest. However, his mind was filled with astonishment. My agility attribute has already reached 75 points, but this guy is at least twice as fast as me. How on earth did he do it? If he were to know that Fang Xinjian, who had just used the Supreme Mistwind sword, was still far from reaching his maximum speed, who knew what he would think? Just as Fang Xinjian paused for a moment, 2 sharp whistles rang out. The piercing screeches in the air sounded as if countless female ghosts were screaming crazily at the same time. 2 arrows, one red and one white, shot out fiercely towards Fang Xinjian. The red arrow was covered in flames, and each time the flames exploded crazily, it would increase its speed rapidly. The white arrow was encompassed by layers of whirlwinds, unceasingly breaking through the air to increase its speed. The speed at which the 2 arrows shot out was too fast. Almost at the moment the sound reached Fang Xinjian's ears, the 2 arrows had already arrived 1 meter before him, one from the top and one from the bottom, one from the left and one from the right, piercing towards his left hand and right leg respectively. Their speed was fast enough for ordinary knights, but to the current Fang Xinjian it was still too slow. With a slight movement of his left hand and right leg, he easily dodged the arrows. The metal sword in Fang Xinjian's hand slashed out once again, and countless whirlwinds gushed forth, surrounding his body. With a burst of speed, the ground under his feet split open once again, and the air once again rang out with the piercing screeches. "Gather together!" Claude cried out in surprise. The remaining 8 of them had all gathered together, their reduced force fields covering each other. Even if Fang Xinjian were to barge in recklessly, he would definitely be defeated. This was also a common method for knights to work together to fight against high-speed opponents or long-range opponent. However, this time around, Fang Xinjian did not attack anyone. His body flashed continuously, and he arrived at the place where he had stabbed his sword into the ground. Under everyone's astonished gazes, the long sword in Fang Xinjian's hand once again brought along endless sword cheese, sweeping out towards the sword formation under his feet. The next moment, light swoosh 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 sounds rang out, and amidst countless streams of sword cheese, several tens of longswords were like swimming dragons, enveloped by sword cheese, sweeping through the space 10 meters around Fang Xinjian. Level 20 Supreme Mistwind Sword's special effect. Controlling cheese with the sword, controlling swords with cheese. Chapter 84. Seeing this scene, Claude's countenance changed. The next moment, Fang Xinjian's longsword swept out once again, bringing along tens of flying swords as he charged towards the remaining 8 members of Class 253. The blue-haired swordsman bellowed, "Everyone, use your force field to block at full power. Leader I'll stop this lad." Claude let out a loud bellow, activating his job's technique. Streams of bronze-colored air currents encompassed his body, making it seem as if he was wearing a layer of golden armor. In the next moment, the 2 axes in his hands trembled fiercely, activating the killing technique Tornado of Massacre. His entire body started to spin crazily, and a myriad of axe shadows filled up every inch of space on his body. He brought along a tornado as he clashed fiercely against Fang Xinjian. A series of clanging sounds rang out continuously. Claude was like a berserk lion, transforming into a massacre tornado, slashing out in all directions with his axes. Each strike tore through the strong gales, bringing along waves of sharp aura. Fang Xinjian was like an omnipresent tempest. Countless sword cheese and long swords danced in the air, surrounding Claude and his teammates behind him. Fang Xinjian himself was hidden within the tempest, making it impossible for others to see his figure. At the start, Claude was still able to rely on his over 70 agility and reaction to continuously disperse Fang Xinjian's sword cheese. However, as the Supreme Mistwind sword continued to be performed, Fang Xinjian's speed increased rapidly, and Claude was soon unable to react. More and more sword cheese slashed onto his body, clashing against that bronze-colored aura, creating the sound of metal clashing. Damn it, the Supreme Mistwind sword still has such a move? The sounds of explosions became increasingly concentrated, and in the end Claude felt as if he was surrounded by countless people, with thousands of long swords piercing towards his body at every moment. He decided not to defend anymore, but curled up, relying solely on his job's techniques to fend off the attack. Finally, as if his endurance and accumulation had reached an extreme, with a loud rumble, Claude's body stretched out like a bomb. Violent cheese, accompanied by the full eruption of his physical body and reduced force field, turned into layers of transparent ripples that bounced out in all directions. At the same time, several tens of longswords, wrapped in Fang Xinjian's sword cheese, pierced towards Claude with all their might. They broke through the layers of shock waves released by Claude, and after a series of frenzied tremors, all of them pierced into Claude's body. In the next moment, Claude's entire body, including his forehead, neck, chest, back, and limbs, were pierced by numerous swords. However, the entire stabbing motion only lasted for less than a second before all the swords could no longer withstand the series of pressure and exploded into countless fragments. Although the longsword did not pierce Claude's body, countless forces directly followed the long sword and hit his body, penetrating into his internal organs. How precise was Fang Xinjian's control over the force when he wielded his sword? Moreover, he had trained in 31 sets of nurturing sword techniques, and his control over his muscles, bones, and internal organs was at a textbook level. The moment the force entered his body, Claude felt as if his internal organs had exploded in that instant. He spat out a mouthful of blood and knelt down on the ground. He exhaled and said furiously, "Humph, if my mystic armor golden body could be trained to level 10, my internal organs would be as tough as steel. This move of yours wouldn't have been able to break me." Fang Xinjian's body slowly floated down before him, countless gusts of strong gales flying to and fro behind him. As he walked, the gales passed by Claude's body inch by inch, as if Claude was his pet. "If I wanted to kill you, you'd be long dead." After saying this, without waiting for Claude's reaction, Fang Xinjian had already arrived before the remaining members of Class 253. Claude turned back and saw that other than the blue-haired swordsman and the other 4 sword-wielding knights, the rest of them had already fainted and lost consciousness. At the same time that Fang Xinjian had defeated Claude, he had also broken through the defense of his teammate. If they had unleashed their reduced force fields at full power, it would have been very difficult for Fang Xinjian to break through them. However, they were not the same person, and there would definitely be gaps between their teamwork. Wherever their reduced force fields covered, there would be strong and weak ones, sometimes strong and sometimes weak. Faced with Fang Xinjian's sword cheese which penetrated through every single opening, as well as the speed of his sword which they were unable to react to, failure was the only possibility. Claude's countenance turned grim. Originally, when he was dealing with Fang Xinjian, due to the absolute difference in speed, he had been in a situation where he could only take a beating without being able to retaliate. Now that he realized that Fang Xinjian's sword techniques were so exquisite, it meant that when Fang Xinjian had said earlier that if he wanted to kill him, he'd be long dead, he'd be long dead. Fang Xinjian looked at the remaining 4 sword-wielding knights, and with a shake of his sword, he said, "Come at me together." On the cliff, Huang Lin laughed out loud. "I'm sorry, everyone. It's only been 8 minutes, right? Seems like I've won this round." "You old rascal," Netherworld Valley's Tina said in displeasure. "You've long known of Fang Xinjian's abilities, haven't you? That's why you provoked us to bet with you." "Hee, so what if I've long known?" Huang Lin smiled. "If I'd said that he'd be able to defeat 10 knights single-handedly, would any of you have believed me?" Everyone exchanged glances. They knew that if Huang Lin had said this earlier on, it would have been very hard for them to believe it as well. After all, to think that a knight who had only transitioned for a month would be able to defeat 10 knights who had transitioned for 3 years. This information was too shocking. All the geniuses who had appeared in history had left their names in the annals of history, and some had even become divine-level characters in the end. This was especially so for Fang Xinjian's control of sword qis earlier, which had displayed an unprecedented level of exquisite sword arts, the supreme Mistwind sword which had broken through all limits. At this moment, the gazes they used to look at Fang Xinjian were still different. Their eyes were filled with astonishment, envy, jealousy, and all sorts of other emotions. They suddenly realized that they might be witnessing the beginning of a legend, as long as Fang Xinjian did not fall midway. Of course, the expressions of those who had lost the bet did not look good either. Netherworld Valley's Tina's face twitched. Their valley specialized in using poison to detoxify poisons, and each bottle of antidote they created was equivalent to a few lives. Even though she was an elder in the faction, to hand over 100 bottles at one go was a huge loss. How could she not feel the pinch? Tina shook her head. Sigh, why isn't this Fang Xinjian a student of our Netherworld Valley? Huang Lin said unhappily, your valley specializes in poison, not swords. Tina smiled and said, we can give him medicine every day to strengthen his body. Look at how strong Claude's body is. Treja Clan's clan head frowned slightly, his face looking even more distressed. Rebecca, that crazy old woman. This Fang Xinjian is so powerful. Seems like he won't be placated by body-tempering ointment. Should we get rid of him before he rises up? Or should we add more chips and rope him over to our side? However, just thinking of the price they would have to pay for either of these two options made the distressed expression on his face even more intense. Only when he thought of Kaunitz did he relax a little. Thankfully, that person has taken a liking to Kaunitz. This way, we won't have to worry too much about Fang Xinjian becoming stronger. Chapter 85. Cursed City Lord looked at Fang Xinjian and the 4 shaky swordsmen, and his countenance turned even more grim, turning as black as the bottom of a pot. Thinking of the conferred knight's remains that he was about to hand over, he felt even more pained. He had been rearing 20 wind eagles, and each one of them could be said to be his treasures. They were all precious resources that could be used by his clan to nurture talents in the future. However, 10 of them had been snatched away by Headmaster Jackson, and this had already caused him great pain. Now, he was going to hand over the conferred knight's remains that he had gathered with great difficulty. These were treasures that could be used to create superior remains divine weapons in the future, treasures that could suppress a region. Seeing how black his face was, Huang Lin smiled and said, City Lord, when will the conferred knight's remains be sent over? Are you afraid that I won't keep to my word? With that, he waved his sleeves and turned to leave. I'll send it over tomorrow. Looking at his disappearing back, Huang Lin smiled inwardly. The Treja clan's clan head said with a bitter expression, I'll also send someone to send the body-tempering medicine over next year. Huang Lin then looked at the leader of the aristocratic academy, Houston, and asked, when will the deed of the house be sent over? Houston said unwillingly, got it. I'll send someone to send it over in a while. Huang Lin added, also, don't remove the servants, gardeners, housekeepers, and all sorts of plants and furniture. Houston let out a snort and said, don't worry. I'm not such a sore loser. In his heart, he was cursing Fang Xinjian for being a sly old fox. He had just been thinking of removing everything in the manor and losing an empty house to Fang Xinjian. However, regardless of how they felt about the bet, the fact that Fang Xinjian had single-handedly defeated 10 knights a month after his job transition had been deeply imprinted in their minds. To be honest, any one of them would be able to defeat 10 ordinary knights. However, how long had they been cultivating? How long had Fang Xinjian been cultivating for? This was no longer something that could be simply described as a genius. All the clans and influences in Cursed seemed to have slightly changed their plans regarding the academy because of Fang Xinjian's performance today. Naturally, Fang Xinjian did not know that his master and the headmaster had already won a huge pile of gifts for him. He held his sword with one hand and seemed to casually sweep and stab with his sword. However, it was this seemingly casual sword strike that seemed to be extremely fast in the eyes of ordinary people. Even the wind from the sword that swept past their faces gave them the feeling that they were being slashed by a sharp blade. 4 swordsmen surrounded Fang Xinjian. It was clear that the 4 of them were attacking Fang Xinjian from 4 directions, but they felt as though they were being surrounded by countless people. Long swords pierced through the air, shining with dazzling sword light. At every moment, it seemed as though there were countless sharp swords flying towards them. Quick, quick! It was too fast. That was their only thought at the moment. Fang Xinjian's sword seemed to be at their throats at all times, able to take away their distance at any time. They could only desperately display all the sword techniques they knew, trying their best to resist the waves of attacks that came one after another like a tsunami. Crisp clanging sounds rang out incessantly from the swords of the 4 swordsmen, and the tidal-like attacks continued to press down on their nerves. Each sword blade seemed to sweep past their hearts, throats, and temples. Every strike of the sword seemed to drain every ounce of their strength. Unknowingly, they were no longer able to use their killing technique. Just relying on the simplest nurturing and training techniques, they squeezed out their energy time and time again, breaking through their limits time and time again, trying to catch up to Fang Xinjian's pace. Every minute and every second seemed to drag on like a year. Finally, with 4 consecutive clanging sounds, the swords in the hands of the 4 swordsmen were all sent flying. After spinning a few rounds in midair, they stabbed into the ground. The 4 swordsmen, including the blue-haired knight, all let out a breath. They either half knelt or fell to the ground, panting heavily. At this moment they actually felt more relaxed, as though it was finally over. The blue-haired knight panted heavily, feeling as though his heart was about to jump out from his chest. All the muscles in his body did not want to move in the slightest. He looked at Fang Xinjian in a daze. Fang Xinjian stood still with his sword in hand, his face not flushed nor was he out of breath. From the way he strolled leisurely, it was impossible to tell that he had just experienced an intense battle. This guy. What kind of monster is he? I've always known that every prefectural champion is a ferocious beast in human form. But this Fang Xinjian. It's only been a *King month since he transitioned. Is he going to let us live? The others were also horrified, and their expressions were more or less the same. Behind Fang Xinjian, Zhou Yong, who had been shouting and scolding Fang Xinjian, was like a duck whose neck had been squeezed. His mouth was agape, but he could not say a single word. He stared at Fang Xinjian with his eyes wide open, as though he was looking at some prehistoric beast. Ferdinand let out a bitter laugh, lying on the ground with his back facing the sky. He really did not know how he should comment on this match. Robert looked at Fang Xinjian with gleaming eyes, rejoicing at his own judgment. He was now even more determined to follow Fang Xinjian. Fang Xinjian sat cross-legged on the ground, continuously practicing the sword techniques he had just learned in his mind. Other than the 2 sets of nurturing sword techniques he had learned from Zhou Yong, he had also learned another 8 sets of nurturing sword techniques from the 4 swordsmen he had trampled on earlier. These 4 people came from different factions and academies, and after depleting their energy, he had learned another 8 sets of nurturing sword techniques from them. However, after practicing for a while in his mind, he realized that everyone was still staring at him in a daze. He opened his eyes, threw a glance at Robert and said, "Go take over their fortress. That way the match will end, right?" Yes, I got it." Robert looked at Fang Xinjian, who was brimming with killing intent, and his voice was trembling. He nodded and ran towards the opponent's fortress. Claude laughed coldly, there's finally a good show to watch. Fang Xinjian, I really want to know what the outcome would be if you were to fight with those freaks from Class 248 and Class 249. Class 248 and Class 249 were the classes that had been in existence for the longest time. They were older than Fang Xinjian and the others by 7 to 8 years. They were also publicly acknowledged as the strongest class in the academy. The prefectural champions of the two classes were also recognized as the two strongest knights in the entire academy. Even the one from Class 248, who had passed the regional selection, was only considered to be slightly stronger than the two of them. With the end of the match, Huang Lin and the headmaster walked out with smiles on their faces. They had won so many things today. The bone remains that Cursed City Lord had brought could be used to forge a divine weapon for Fang Xinjian. The antidote from the Netherworld Valley could be used as the Academy's resource reserve. Even if they were to sell it, it would be a huge sum of money. As for the body-tempering potion that Treasure Clan's clan head had lost, they could use it directly on Fang Xinjian to increase his body's potential. There was also the manor that the old aristocrat, Houston, had lost. It was priceless. Even if they had no one to stay in, they could sell it for a huge sum of money. However, just as they walked out of the valley and headed in the direction of the academy, a silhouette suddenly blocked their way. The two of them stopped and focused their gazes. It was Cursed City Lord who had blocked their way. Huang Lin smiled. Hey, old man, don't tell me that you're unwilling to lose and want to kill us to silence us? Cursed City Lord frowned and said, It's like this. You all know that my skills with staffs are superb. But my youngest daughter just happens to like sword and saber arts. Today, I saw that Fang Xinjian's sword arts aren't bad. How about getting him to give my daughter some guidance? Huang Lin was stunned for a moment before he said, Old man, don't tell me you're thinking of introducing your daughter to Xinjian? Hearing Huang Lin say it so straightforwardly, Cursed City Lord could not help but blush. He said, What nonsense are you talking about? I'm just letting the youngsters get to know each other. It turned out that when he had left earlier, the more he thought about it, the more resentful he felt. Thinking of how he had to give away the bone remains that he had just obtained not too long ago, he felt even more displeased. However, just then, one of his subordinates mentioned to him that Fang Xinjian did not seem to have any relative. If he could take him in as a son-in-law and let him join their family, then not only would the superior remains divine weapon be his, even Fang Xinjian would be considered half a son to him. Hearing this suggestion, Cursed City Lord immediately became interested. This was why Huang Lin had seen this scene before him. Seeing that Huang Lin still wanted to say something, Cursed City Lord shouted, All right. I'll get my daughter to send the bone remains over tomorrow. After that, just get Fang Xinjian to give her some pointers on her sword arts every week. With that, he flew off without even turning back, as if he was not worried that Huang Lin and the others would not agree. Chapter 86. As Robert ran off to take over the opponent's fortress, the instructors who were acting as judges in the valley immediately announced the end of the competition. Class 256, which Fang Xinjian was in, was the victor. On the cliff, everyone in Class 252 sank into a strange silence. Everyone's mind seemed to be replaying the scene where Fang Xinjian had defeated Class 253 like an autumn gale sweeping up fallen leaves. Renaud took in a deep breath and stared fixedly at Fang Xinjian, who was sitting cross-legged and cultivating in silence. He suddenly said, This Fang Xinjian is very powerful. A windstorm sword hero is naturally powerful. Xiao Yi's eyes were filled with a cold gleam. It's just that I didn't expect him to be this powerful. At this moment, a strong killing intent surged in both of their hearts. Seeing a young man who had only transitioned for a month, easily defeating a powerful knight who had transitioned for 3 years, how could they not be jealous and furious? They were burning with jealousy, wishing that they could replace Fang Xinjian. Such talent, such talent! Why isn't it with me? Xiao Yi's eyes were fixed on Fang Xinjian, revealing a snake-like greedy gaze. However, the next moment they retracted their killing intent. At least for now, in the academy, it was impossible for them to attack Fang Xinjian. There's no need to fear the other people in Class 256. The key is Fang Xinjian. If we want to defeat them, we'll just have to defeat Fang Xinjian, Renaud said, licking his lips. Maybe we don't have to defeat them. Xiao Yi narrowed his eyes and said, maybe we just have to hold them back. Moreover, in this world, speed does not mean invincibility. That's right. Renaud grinned. Speaking of which, I like fast opponents the most. Just then, a commoner knight from their class ran over, walked to Xiao Yi's side and said, Young Master Xiao Yi, someone from your family has come. He says he has something for you. Seeing the judge announce the victory, Fang Xinjian slowly stood up. Anthony and Jack were the first to rush up, saying excitedly, We won, we won. Xinjian, you're too amazing. You single-handedly defeated all 10 of them. Ferdinand, as well as Carter and Zhou Yong, who were behind him, had also recovered their strength and stood up. However, their countenances were extremely grim. Although they had won the competition, they had become clowns on the battlefield, let alone performing well. They had been defeated by Fang Xinjian alone in front of so many big shots. It was too embarrassing. Ferdinand's countenance was also extremely grim. He took a long look at Fang Xinjian and then turned to leave. Class 253's Claude was still sitting on the ground, panting heavily. He looked at Fang Xinjian and said, You've won this time. I won't lose to you again. Fang Xinjian threw a glance at him, not even bothering to reply. Claude was already a monster among commoners, but when faced with a talent like Fang Xinjian's, once he was surpassed, he would never have the chance to catch up to him in this lifetime. Seeing how Fang Xinjian was looking down on him, Claude let out a cold snort, feeling indignant. However, he did not say anything else. He only made up his mind to train harder when he got back. Seems like it's time to make a trip back to Netherworld Valley. Even if I have to train my 100 poison battle physique, I must win against this guy at least once. Jack, who was at the side, said, Let's go have a big meal to celebrate. Fang Xinjian shook his head. You guys go ahead. Just put the money on me. Boris smiled. Coming from the Shadow Moon Academy, he had been living in the forest all year round, spending his days hunting and barbecuing. The people from their academy revered the strong and power the most. Initially, he had thought that Kaunitz, Barbara, Ferdinand, and himself were the strongest in this batch. However, ever since Fang Xinjian had defeated Kaunitz previously and then defeated 10 knights right before his eyes, his gaze toward Fang Xinjian was now filled with admiration. Xinjian, please come to my villa for a gathering. I've brought our academy's barbecued ferocious beast. This is the specialty of our Shadow Moon Academy. You must try it. Fang Xinjian shook his head. Right now, his mind was filled with the new sword techniques he had learned today. How could he be interested in having a gathering with them? The next moment, disregarding the others' attempts to stop him, Fang Xinjian dashed out with a slight sway. From afar, he looked like a black line cutting across the sky, heading in the direction of the academy. However, just as his silhouette was about to disappear, a voice rang out from afar, drifting into the ears of the few of them. Send a set of barbecued meat to my villa. Jack blinked and said, Recently, Xinjian seems to like eating more and more. Anthony smiled and said, It must be that the headmaster has stuffed him with too many delicacies, causing his appetite to swell. Fang Xinjian turned into many illusions, and within a few minutes, he had brought along strong gales as he dashed into the training room. Along the way, the servants who saw him all nodded and bowed. Then, with a loud sound, the door to the training room was shut heavily. In the room, Fang Xinjian turned into a sky full of sword shadows, performing the sword techniques he had secretly learned today without holding back. He had learned a total of 10 sets of nurturing sword techniques from his opponents today. Fang Xinjian had been practicing the techniques in his mind, and his cultivation speed was already faster than that of ordinary people. Now that he was performing them physically, the sky full of sword shadows bloomed, as if hundreds of flowers were blooming at the same time, releasing countless resplendent sword lights. The 10 sets of nurturing sword techniques he had just learned also continued to grow stronger at a speed that could be seen by the naked eye. His current experience in sword arts, as well as his cultivation in sword arts, could not be mentioned in the same breath as in the past. His talent in sword arts was even greater, and within a short 5 hours, he had already trained more than half of the sword techniques to level 10. He then rested for a while, ate the dinner sent by the academy, and continued his practice. After another 3 hours, he had trained all 10 sets of sword techniques he had learned to level 10. However, only 2 sets of sword techniques had provided him with additional attribute. This meant that the effects of these 2 sets of sword techniques were not the same as the other nurturing sword techniques he had learned, and could provide him with additional potential. With a ratio of 2 out of 10, as he cultivated more and more nurturing sword techniques, the number of nurturing sword techniques he could find that were effective would also decrease. Wiping the sweat off his forehead, Fang Xinjian saw a maid dozing off as she waited for him. Next to the maid was a small cart. Fang Xinjian walked up to her, opened the cover of the small cart, and saw a big bowl of barbecued meat placed there. It was a pity that a lot of time had passed, and the barbecued meat had already turned cold. However, he did not care about this. He tore off a big piece of meat and put it into his mouth. Just then, the maids at the side woke up. Seeing Fang Xinjian's actions, they got a shock and said loudly, "So? Sorry. Let me help you heat it up." "There's no need." Fang Xinjian waved the maid away, and quickly stuffed the entire piece of barbecued meat into his mouth. He did not look at the 10 or so potential points he had gained, but was instead savoring the taste of the barbecued meat. Not bad. After finishing the last piece, Fang Xinjian snapped his fingers, and a maid walked over. "Tell the chefs to learn how to make this barbecued meat. I want to eat it tomorrow." "Yes." The maid seemed to be used to it, nodding and leaving. As Fang Xinjian walked towards his room, he looked at his stats window. On it, there were a few blurry words that seemed to be trying to form, but were unable to. This was the situation that had started after he had trained all 10 sets of nurturing sword techniques to level 10 today. Fang Xinjian looked at this scene curiously, thinking to himself, "What speciality is this? Is there anything else I can't form? Could it be that I need to cultivate more nurturing sword techniques?" You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.